Good afternoon again. Welcome to this working session of the 2019 HDIM, which I will have the pleasure to moderate. My name is Omer Fischer. I'm head of the Human Rights Department at OSCE ODIHR, and I will be moderating this session devoted to the topics of the prevention of torture, an exchange of views on the question of abolition of capital punishment and protection of human rights and fighting terrorism. A few reminders before we start. We will have 3 hours for this session. We will have some time for our introducer to provide some introductory remarks and some food for thought for the ensuing discussion. And there will be then space for participants and all of you to provide comments, statements, and questions. And during the last 15 minutes, delegations of OSCE participating states will have the possibility to exercise the right of reply, and if there is time, we will hear also final reflections from the introducer, after which I will close the session. On the list of speakers, if I understand, we have already reached a very high number of speakers that would have register themselves to take part in the working session. So the maximum number of participants we can sign up for participation is 50, and I think we have actually gone already well beyond that limit. So the list is closed, in fact, as it reached the limit of 50 participants. As always, seats in the plenary room are designated as indicated on signs placed around the table. Please respect the seating arrangement throughout the session. Live streaming of the 2019 Human Dimension Implementation Meeting is available. Filming with cameras and video cameras is only permitted by accredited journalists during the opening and closing plenary sessions, and no other audiovisual recordings should be undertaken without the explicit permission of individuals being recorded. With this initial reminder, I'm now giving the floor to our introducer today, Mary Strathers, who is the director of Amnesty International's Eastern Europe and Central Asia Regional Office and acting director for the Europe Regional Office, overseeing research, campaigning, and advocacy in the entire Europe and Central Asia region. Amnesty International is a global movement of more than 7 million people in over 150 countries who campaign to end abuses of human rights. Mary has worked for over 20 years in human rights and civil society donor funding with international organizations and government. Mrs. Strathers, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Omar. Good afternoon. And many thanks indeed to ODIHR and the organizers of this 2019 Human Dimension Implementation Meeting for inviting Amnesty International to contribute introductory remarks for today's Rule of Law session on terrorism, torture, and the death penalty. My comments will primarily focus on protecting human rights while fighting terrorism, an area of research that stretches far back in Amnesty's nearly 60-year-long history. While it's important to acknowledge the specific challenges posed by international terrorism, it is equally crucial to recognize that the phenomenon of political violence directed at the state and often targeting innocent civilians has very long historical roots. In that regard, states are obligated to support the victims of such violent attacks and their families with comprehensive assistance programs that address victims' rights to commemoration, humane treatment, ongoing medical, psychological, social, and material assistance, and access to information, truth, and justice, as well as effective remedies, including reparations. Now, it is axiomatic that states must protect people present on their territories from such wanton violence. Upholding the right to life and enabling people to move freely and think freely are essential tasks for any government. But they are not tasks that should be achieved by any means. Crucially, they are not tasks that should or can be achieved by riding roughshod over the very human rights that governments are legally obligated to uphold. A key question for today's session asks if and how OSCE participating states comply with their obligations to counter terrorism and violent extremism and radicalization leading to terrorism, while at the same time complying with their international human rights commitments. It's unfortunate to report that the vast majority of states in the OSCE region routinely and increasingly violate people's human rights in the name of national security. While the most draconian deviations from rights protections often happen in the context of a formally declared state of emergency, typically invoked after a violent attack, we see across the region emergency-type measures being embedded in ordinary criminal law. This and other legislative and policy initiatives in the name of national security have seriously eroded human rights protection across the OSCE. Instead of embracing the principle that human rights and security are mutually reinforcing, states far too often invoke national security to target human rights defenders, journalists, social media influencers, artists, environmental and other activists, and religious and ethnic minorities. Violent attacks thus produce different sets of victims, those killed or injured in such attacks and their families, and those targeted by counterterrorism measures that violate their human rights, including the right to life, the absolute prohibition against torture and other ill treatment, and the rights to liberty and security of person, freedom of expression, association, movement, privacy, and non-discrimination. A core problem in the counterterrorism context is the issue of definitions. These words, terrorism, violent extremism, and radicalization, have no universally agreed definitions. That leaves these concepts open to broad interpretation and application, and indeed to misapplication and abuse. Since late 2001, there has been a proliferation of new laws and policies, many mandated by the UN under Security Council resolutions or by EU directives, that have chipped away at the edifice of international human rights protections so carefully constructed over the last half-century. Such overly broad and vague counterterrorism laws are increasingly and deliberately used by states to target civil society. In her March 2019 report, Impact of Measures to Address Terrorism and Violent Extremism on Civic Space and the Rights of Civil Society Actors and Human Rights Defenders, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights while Countering Terrorism presents a rigorous analysis of how the continual expansion and proliferation of security measures, and as I said, their deliberate misuse and misapplication, are indisputably linked to the shrinking of space for civil society. A particularly sobering example of this link is the fact that since the inception of the Special Rapporteur's mandate in 2005, a full 66% of all relevant communications to UN member states by the respective mandate holders have related to states targeting civil society actors with broadly defined security-related measures and/or laws and policies allegedly intended to prevent and counter violent extremism. According to the rapporteur, this robust empirical finding measured from 2005 to 2018 affirms that the targeting of civil society is not a random or incidental aspect of counterterrorism law and practice. It suggests the hard wiring of misuse into counterterrorism measures taken by states around the globe. Being identified or labeled as a terrorist or violent extremist, or a person who has been radicalized on the basis of such broad and vague laws, can also have knock-on effects that affect families and entire communities due to a guilt by association approach. While this is true to various degrees across the OSCE region, it is especially acute in the East, where families of suspected members of terrorist and alleged extremist groups are publicly shamed, attacked by mobs, and beaten, including children and elderly relatives. In some cases, homes and properties have been attacked and confiscated by the authorities, people have been summarily dismissed from their jobs, and some have been detained and tortured or otherwise ill-treated to attempt to compel them to incriminate their relatives. In other cases, family members in a country are targeted and abused to compel a person outside the country to return home. In terms of deportation and extraditions, Amnesty has documented numerous cases where European states have forcibly returned alleged national security suspects to the other OSCE participating states, where those individuals have faced a real risk of torture and other ill treatment upon return. The principle of non-refoulement has been systematically undermined across the region in the name of national security, despite the fact that the prohibition against torture is absolute and allows for no exceptions, including on grounds of national security or public order. Indeed, states to the east of the region continue to employ torture to extract confessions from persons alleged to be threats to national security. Such evidence is often admitted into trials in clear violation of the prohibition against torture and the imperative to exclude from consideration in criminal proceedings evidence extracted under torture. As I've heard in other sessions, and I will repeat, people across the OSCE region are also increasingly identified by law enforcement as potential threats or extremists for exercising their freedom of expression, often on social media platforms, which are increasingly monitored by the state and private tech companies. In many cases, speech and other forms of expression that governments have determined are not in conformity with a country's values or that are considered affronts to national dignity have been targeted. Laws that criminalize such speech or so-called glorification or apology of terrorism often encompass expression that is lawful. Such speech may be offensive or disrespectful or controversial, but unless it amounts to incitement to violence or constitutes unlawful hate speech, it is protected under states' international human rights obligations. Governments and private tech companies must adhere to such international standards to protect freedom of expression and the right to privacy. As well, people subjected to counterterrorism measures in OSCE participating states are often targeted in violation of the principle of non-discrimination. Our research indicates that counterterrorism measures in many places in OSCE member states have proven to be discriminatory on paper and in practice, and specifically have had a disproportionate and profoundly negative impact on Muslims, certain ethnic groups, foreign nationals, and refugees and migrants fleeing violence or economic deprivation. For example, many states in the OSCE region have adopted laws that allow authorities to apply administrative measures that restrict people's freedom of movement and association, that is, by requiring people to reside only in a certain neighborhood, abide by a daily curfew, or report to the police on a regular basis, but without ever charging them with a recognizable criminal offense. In addition to the key rights concerns noted thus far, the return of foreign fighters from the conflicts in Iraq and Syria also raises a set of complex human rights problems. In this regard, ODIHR is to be commended for publishing its useful guidelines for addressing the threats and challenges of foreign terrorist fighters within a human rights framework in 2018. It's fundamental for Amnesty International that any person, whether foreigner or national, reasonably suspected of having committed war crimes or crimes under international law in those conflicts be investigated, and if credible admissible evidence is produced, prosecuted in proceedings that conform with international fair trial standards and excluding the death penalty. Amnesty International has serious concerns that fair trials with no application of the death penalty cannot be executed in either Iraq or Syria at the moment, and is therefore called on the international community to work collectively to ensure that the perpetrators of crimes in those conflicts do not enjoy impunity, but also receive fair process. Persons under the age of 18 who have engaged in hostilities, whether nationals of Syria or Iraq or foreigners, should be treated as children in conformity with best interests of the child standard and afforded treatment and process that conforms with international juvenile justice standards and other relevant international standards and guidelines. For example, those regarding the treatment and rehabilitation of child soldiers. As for foreign nationals who remain in camps or facilities in Iraq and Syria, they should be notified of their right to seek consular assistance from their home governments, and the authorities should facilitate meaningful and effective access to such assistance. The status of foreign children must be carefully considered. It may be presumed that it is likely to be in their best interest to return or be transferred, in the case of children born abroad, to their country of origin or habitual residence of one of their parents. In such cases, and especially when a request for repatriation or transfer has been made, home states should facilitate the return of the child, taking into consideration their obligations to respect the right to family life and the right of the child not to be separated from his or her parents against their will, except in the most exceptional cases. I'm finishing now, Omar. Women who are foreign nationals and allegedly associated IS state are currently formally detained in Iraq and also in de facto detention camps in Syria. The situation of many of these women is dire, and the following principles should apply to them. None of them should be deprived of their liberty or otherwise punished solely on the basis of either their relationship with individuals suspected of involvement with IS or their irregular entry into a territory, for example, Iraq or Syria. Where the authorities nevertheless do prosecute individuals because of their alleged association with IS, for example, for crimes of membership of IS or illegal entry, and those individuals raise allegations of coercion, such as having been forced to travel to or stay in IS-held territory or subjected to psychological, physical abuse, including rape and other sexual violence, then those allegations must be fully and effectively investigated. This obligation is particularly relevant in cases against women, given the disproportionate incidence of abuse and coercion affecting women in IS-held territory. One final remark. In addition to the substantive issues noted here, we wanted to remark that it's very important that the units in Vienna, in particular the Action Against Terrorism unit, incorporate a human rights perspective into their work by regularly partnering with human rights NGOs and experts. We know that there is cooperation between Vienna and ODIHR, but ODIHR's resources indeed are small and far stretched on counterterrorism and human rights. OSCE participating states should ensure that resources in ODIHR for dedicated work on counterterrorism and its impact on human rights protection is secured, and that civil society actors and organizations that expert in the promotion and protection of human rights are regularly engaged in Vienna and Warsaw. Thank you. I didn't have enough time to say all I wanted, but looking forward to the discussion and interventions.
Thanks a lot, Mary, for your introductory remarks on the challenges related to human rights while countering terrorism and violent extremism and radicalization that lead to terrorism. This is the first topic discussed at this session. Just a couple of words on the other topics in relation to the second topic discussed today. As we've just heard, the use of torture and other ill treatment is among the serious human rights concerns that need to be addressed by all OSCE participating states in accordance with their commitments, and participating states have committed to eradicate torture and ill treatment. So today's discussion also aims to address the progress made by states and civil society from across the OSCE region in this area. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you also about this topic. Let me also draw your attention to the third topic of this working session, the exchange of views on the question of the abolition of capital punishment. On this, let me note that as every year, ODIHR has published its annual background paper on the situation of the death penalty in the OSCE area, with a thematic focus on the relationship between the death penalty and the right to life. Finally, let me remind you of some of the recommendations formulated during last year's HDIM, which are relevant to the topics discussed today, to provide, for example, clear and narrowly phrased definitions of prohibited activities in any specific counterterrorism and counter-extremism legislation with robust and transparent enforcement and independent oversight, to end impunity for violations of human rights while fighting terrorism, ensuring effective investigation of all cases of alleged violations, to strengthen national mechanisms and cooperation between NGOs and the state, including in combating torture. So I look forward to hearing how these and other recommendations made last year during the HDAM have been implemented. A few reminders before opening the floor for interventions. We have a time limit allocated for each intervention. We have a very high number of participants who have indicated their interest in taking part in the session, so we have set the time limit to 2 minutes and 30 seconds. So, and we will remind you, please keep an eye on the time. You can see it on the screen, and we will also remind you when the time expires. All interventions should be presented in meaningful, orderly, and respectful manner, observing the time limit and focusing on recommendations related to the topic of the session. Please keep comments brief and to the point, and please start with the recommendations related to this session's topic. Criticism is welcome, but should be constructive, and do not please read lengthy prepared statements which can distributed via our document distribution desk to ensure that the flow of documents reflect the discussion. Participants can only speak in the capacity in which they are registered, and only entities registered on the speakers list can take the floor. And a reminder to a representative of participating states that points of order can only relate to procedural issues. When it comes to the substance of the matter under discussion, participating states are welcome to use the right of reply. These were the few reminders I wanted to give you before opening the floor to interventions from registered speakers. The first on my list is the Italian Federation for Human Rights, to be followed by the Global Ukraine Foundation. Italian Federation for Human Rights, you have the floor.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, my name is Alyaskar Yerimberov, son of a political prisoner in Kazakhstan, Iskander Yerimberov. I would like to start off by pouring some light, some truth on the real situation in Kazakhstan and how tortures take place. My aunt is Botajer Dumali. She's a lawyer and a human rights defender. She lives in Belgium, where she received a political asylum. She was persecuted by Kazakhstan for her work. Kazakhstan could not extradite her because of her status as a political refugee. The regime arrested my father, her older brother. His name is Iskander Yerimberov, as I already said. My father was arrested in November 2017. He was arrested because of his sister. The charges against him are fabricated and politically motivated. When arrested, my father was told that if he convinces his sister, a political refugee, to come back to Kazakhstan and give false testimonies against people that she has defended in the past, the criminal case against him will be closed. He refused, and he was tortured for over 2 months. My father has been subjected to horrific physical and psychological torture. He was locked up in a freezing cell without sufficient clothing. He was put in a cell with convicted prisoners. They repeatedly beat him up and used psychological torture against him. The investigators were demanding that Iskander falsely incriminate himself. Only interference of international human rights organizations and European politicians have helped to stop the torture. My father was sentenced for 7 years on fabricated charges. The trial was recognized as politically motivated. Human rights defenders and the US missions to OECD called on to release him. In December 2018, the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention concluded that my father is being detained in violation of international law and urged his immediate and unconditional release. But Kazakhstan does not comply with the working group decision, neither does Kazakhstan comply with any other UN decisions as well. I kindly ask all OSCE participant states to raise the issue of Iskander Yerimberov during bilateral meetings with the authorities of Kazakhstan and to demand the release of Iskander Yerimberov. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Global Ukraine Foundation, to be followed by Open Dialogue Foundation. Global Ukraine Foundation, you have the floor.
Здравствуйте, да.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mahmoud Aley, and I'm the son of an Uzbek political prisoner who's a journalist and a civil society leader. He has been sentenced to life in Tajikistan, and his arrest.
Are you from the Global Ukraine Foundation?
Не, Eurasian Dialogue.
Sorry, I did not.
Eurasian Dialogue.
No, sorry. Then it's a speaker from the. I apologize, but it's a speaker from the Global Ukraine Foundation. Is there a representative of the Global Ukraine Foundation in the room? No. Then I would like to give the floor to the Open Dialogue Foundation, the next speaker on my list, to be followed by the Eurasian Dialogue Foundation. Indeed, I think that may be the your organization. So, Open Dialogue Foundation, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Maxim Sitnikov, Open Dialogue Foundation. Dear ladies and gentlemen, the application of torture in the prisons of Kazakhstan is a widely prevalent phenomenon. The authorities are ignoring information about torture from human rights advocates, preferring to use the information of prison officials, which does not conform to reality. The victims of torture are afraid to report breaches of the law because this may threaten their life. Since March 2019, human rights defenders have recorded at least 50 complaints regarding tortures and ill treatment in Kazakhstani jails and detention facilities. The investigation was conducted only when victims of tortures have died or when the evidence of tortures cannot be hidden. On 23rd April 2019, Special Forces and National Guard troops went to the prison in Zarechny, Almaty region for so-called inspection of prisoners, during which detainees were beaten and tortured. As a result, 10 prisoners cut their veins in sign of protest. In the same colony, political prisoner Aset Abishev was repeatedly beaten on the head. This is a picture from Zarechny colony showing a prisoner being tortured. Kazakhstani authorities are trying to hide facts of tortures. In 2018, human rights defender Yelena Semenova was subjected to criminal prosecution for dissemination of information regarding tortures in Kazakhstan. Russian prisoner Vitaly Buntov has been repeatedly tortured since 2010. In 2012, the European Court of Human Rights recognized the fact that torture had been used against Buntov and ordered Russian authorities to carry out new investigation. Unfortunately, none of those who tortured Vitaly Buntov has been brought to justice. On 12 September 2019, Russian lawyer Dmitry Sotnikov was beaten at the Novomoskovsk district court of Tula. The court officials forcibly prevented him from performing his professional duties. Police officers transferred him to the investigative committee, where a lawyer was tortured by beating of the head and slamming a door shut on fingers. The Open Dialogue Foundation urges OSCE participant states to publicly condemn acts of violations of basic human rights in Kazakhstan and Russia. We recommend the OSCE to organize regular monitoring missions to places of confinement in Kazakhstan and Russia. We call Russian authorities to investigate the use of physical force against prisoner Vitaly Buntov and lawyer Dmitry Sotnikov. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Eurasian Dialogue Institution, to be followed by the by Human Rights Without Frontiers. Eurasian Dialogue Institution, you have the floor.
Здравствуйте.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Mahmoud Ali, the son of a Tajik political prisoner who is a journalist, who's with the Islamic Renaissance Party, and a civil society leader. He's been sentenced to life in Tajikistan. The arrest, the investigation took place with many violations of the national legislation, and this has been verified by many human rights organizations, and there's even a decision of March 2018 of the UN Human Rights Committee concerning this. I would appeal for his immediate release. Tajikistan must fulfill its fundamental commitments, and yet they continue to put pressure on my father to try to get him to criticize the people with whom he has worked on public television. He is systematically subject to torture since 2015. Even in February of this year, he had a heart attack, and for 10 days he was left with no medical care whatsoever, in extreme pain. Now, he was tortured from the very first day of his detention, even before any investigation started. My mother, my grandmother, and my aunt have visited him on several occasions, and they have seen marks of torture on his face. And my mother has written to the prosecutor general, but there has been no reaction of the authorities to these reports of criminal violations. Dear participating states, my family really needs your support. Don't let the authorities kill him. My father really needs your support.
The next speaker is Human Rights Without Frontiers, to be followed by the independent human rights protectors. Human Rights Without Frontiers, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Guaranteeing the safety of its population from terrorist acts and other forms of crime is a major responsibility of and duty on the state, but not at the price of denying human rights. There has to be a balance. In Spain, an emblematic case where no balance existed and human rights were discarded altogether is the treatment of the Kokorev family. Vladimir Kokorev and his wife Yulia, both in their 60s, and their 33-year-old son, Igor. In this case, Spain held 3 family members in lengthy pre-trial detention, combined with no access to their files, a regime called secreto de sumario, and subject to particularly harsh prison conditions reserved for terrorists, terrorist suspects, and violent criminals. Under Spanish law, this system of surveillance of terrorists, terrorism suspects, and violent criminals is known as FIES, or Ficheros de Internos de Especial Seguimiento. Considering that in Spain parts of the anti-terrorist legislation are now being imposed on non-violent and non-dangerous persons who are not even terrorism suspects and result in unfair detention conditions and extensive pre-trial detention periods, Human Rights Without Frontiers recommends that the Spanish authorities repeal the law on incommunicado detention, cease holding detainees without formal charges, make much more extensive use of alternatives to prison detention, cease using the FIES classification for non-dangerous inmates, abolish the secreto de sumario, cease using pre-trial detention as a means of punishment, respect the presumption of innocence, respect the special diligence obligation, and comply with the recommendations of the UN and the Council of Europe. Human Rights Without Frontiers also recommends that the OSCE ODIHR work with the Venice Commission with a view to addressing jointly the incompatibility of misapplication of the FIES detention regime in Spain with human rights law and the human rights infringements of other unlawful aspects of pretrial detention there more generally. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you. The next speaker is the independent human rights protectors, to be followed by fair trials. Independent human rights protectors, you have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, today I want to tell you about one of the most important problems in Tajikistan: psychological and physical torture. Psychological torture begins at birth. Obstetricians ask for bribes from mothers. This has become common currency over the last 20 years. Then further psychological torture is forced upon us for the rest of our lives. We urge everyone to apply the law so as to prevent torture being committed. We want lawyers involved. For instance, we need to change the law so that minors can only be questioned when their guardians or parents are present. We should stop videotaping questionings if the lawyer is not present. We also want to ensure that you can't simply file a case as being confidential. We want unimpeded access for the ICIC and for national human rights organizations, access to the prisons in Tajikistan. There is torture in places of detention. What I would like to focus on is torture in the army and other places of detention and confinement. The investigative and prosecutorial bodies often use very harsh torture methods in order to extract a confession from the accused. For instance, Ahmed Tukiatov, on the 31st of March of this year in Dushanbe, was taken by 2 policemen because he was urinating on the shores of the Dushanbe River. As a result, he is now impotent. In fact, what happened is that the policeman brought charges against the victim, accusing him of robbing them. Representatives in the room today, representatives of the government, have often accused the opposition of participating in terrorism. The representative once said that he doesn't consider beatings as being torture, and the policemen seem to do the same. I must also say that lawyers in Tajikistan are not independent. They depend on the authorities, and they're afraid to take up cases which make the headlines. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Fair Trials, to be followed by the Association of Central Asian Migrants. Fair Trials, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Fair Trials would like to call on the OSCE and participating countries to take a firm stance against the misuse of cross-border police cooperation mechanisms that have been adopted or strengthened in the past 2 decades in a bid to tackle the growing challenges of international terrorism and violent extremism. Fair Trials has witnessed over the past 7 years of our campaign on the reform of Interpol the ongoing misuse of the world's largest policing organization, and in particular a system of red notices and diffusions by many countries, especially those in the OSCE. These tools are all too often being used not for their intended purpose of bringing dangerous individuals, including suspected terrorists, to justice. They continue to be misused to harass and intimidate political dissidents and human rights defenders who pose no threat to international security. Sometimes red notices deliberately target refugees so that wherever they go, they are never free from persecution, however serious the risk they face in their country of origin. Interpol has taken a number of steps to address these challenges through various reforms that try to ensure that communications via systems are checked more thoroughly and subject to stringent complaints procedures. But we believe it needs the help of member countries. It needs member countries to ensure these reforms are effective, for example, through better adherence to its rules and adequate funding and support for its internal review mechanisms. And it also needs their encouragement to adopt further reforms. However, tackling the abuse of Interpol is simply not enough, and it will not guarantee the safety of political dissidents and human rights defenders in exile. Last year, Fair Trials and the CSP Working Group on Counterterrorism and Anti-Extremism and Human Rights published a paper which identified that OSCE participating states use a myriad of different regional cooperation mechanisms, including those adopted by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the CIS to target dissidents in exile. The OSCE and its member states must collaborate to bring these abuses to an end. Interpol and other international police cooperation mechanisms are there to make the world a safer place, not to be used as a tool for exporting human rights abuses. Countries who abuse these systems risk undermining the very frameworks that promote effective responses to security threats across the OSCE and foster distrust. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is the Association of Central Asian Migrants, to be followed by the Crimean Human Rights Group. Association of Central Asian Migrants, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, moderator, ladies and gentlemen. immoral torture is being carried out in Tajikistan by the forces of law and order. This is demonstrated by official reports of a number of international organizations and civil society groups. In particular, political prisoners are subject to moral and physical torture. Mr. Mohammad Ayikh who has been sentenced to life in prison, has said at yet another court hearing that he is being tortured, and he's even named his tortures. Human rights defenders and civil society activists have in fact noted signs of torture on the faces of political prisoners. And on 11 September, before coming to this conference, someone, Mahmoud Khalifa, was forced to sign a declaration to the Prosecutor General, which he signed personally, and this to put pressure on us just ahead of this conference. This was a way of displacing all of the fault, but there is nevertheless evidence of torture of prisoners. Nahid writes in the text that on 11 of September, no one tortured him, just on the day of the travel. One can draw the obvious conclusion that he was tortured after that, because we have seen signs on his body of that since then. Now, as last year and this year, the representatives of the official delegation of Tajikistan are stepping forward and saying very aggressive things about their opponents. At a press conference, they say certain things that can give a sense of how they deal with political prisoners in their prisons. So we would call on the OSCE to cease the practice of torturing political prisoners in their places of detention.
Rights Group, to be followed by Denmark on behalf of the European Union. Crimean Human Rights Group, you have the floor.
Thank you. Крымская правозащитная
The Crimean Human Rights Group notes that the commitments of the OSCE on human rights are being violated in Crimea, including torture. New facts of torture have come to the fore when some citizens of Ukraine were released from Russian prisoners. In particular, Baluk was illegally moved from Crimea to Tver, and there he was tortured by officers in isolation cell there number 1. He was beaten on his liver, wet cloths were put over his face, and he was hit on the ears. He in fact received 150 electroshocks. There was also sexual abuse involved. The electroshock was applied to his anus, and then he was moved to a prison colony in Tarjok in March. There he was beaten. He was often put in an isolation cell for offenses such as not saying hello to someone from the administration. The temperature in the isolation cell was 16 degrees, and he was there without any warm clothing. And then in August, Vladimir Prisic was returned to Ukraine, and he said that after 8 hours of torture, he was forced to state before a television camera that he admitted to working for Ukrainian security. But then it was interesting that ultimately they did not put him in prison on the basis of an espionage charge, but rather supposedly because he dealt in narcotics. Evgeny Panov was also filmed and accused of espionage, and he was also forced to sign a refusal to use the services of a lawyer hired by his family, and rather to be represented by a court-appointed lawyer. Now, it's quite symbolic that similar events of the Russian authorities in violation of OSCE commitments in the human dimension are violations of principles adopted in Moscow in 1991. there is supposed to be a mechanism of dealing with complaints about torture. Now, the citizens of Ukraine must not be treated this way. Our recommendations are to stop this practice, to allow access to Crimea of international organizations and also medical professionals who can visit people who are in prison and who require medical care, whether on the territory of Russia or on the territory of occupied Crimea.
Denmark, on behalf of the European Union, you have the floor.
Mr. Moderator, I'm honored to speak on behalf of the European Union. The following countries align themselves with this statement: North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Iceland and Liechtenstein. The EU will continue to stand firm and reiterate that the prohibition of torture is absolute and unconditional. The EU also reaffirms our commitment to step up our efforts and strengthen our OSCE commitments to prevent and combat all forms of torture and ill treatment. The EU supports the Global Convention Against Torture initiative and recommends all OSCE participating states to join its group of friends. Further, the EU welcomes the United Nations General Assembly's recent adoption of the Torture-Free Trade Resolution. The OSCE plays a key role in the prevention and prohibition of torture, which was confirmed at the International Conference Effective Multilateralism in the Fight Against Torture, organized by Denmark, Switzerland and Austria in cooperation with the Slovak OSCE chairmanship and ODIHR. The EU recommends all participating states to make use of ODIHR's expertise and the recommendations from the conference. The EU remains deeply alarmed about the continued credible reports of serious human rights violations and abuses in Chechnya, and we reaffirm our call for the Russian Federation to take effective measures to protect the victims and ensure that those responsible or complicit will be brought to justice. The EU calls upon the Russian authorities to implement the recommendations in the report under the OSCE Moscow mechanism of December 2018. The EU remains concerned by the continued enforced disappearance of people in Turkmenistan's prisons, and we reiterate our strong call on Turkmenistan to immediately and effectively eradicate the problem of enforced disappearances. The EU strongly opposes the use of the death penalty at all times and in all circumstances. The EU remains deeply concerned about the lack of transparency surrounding the use of the death penalty in Belarus, which runs counter to the principle of the rule of law. The EU also regrets the recent decision of the US federal government to resume executions, which contradicts the growing trend to abolish the death penalty both in the United States and globally. The EU recommends Belarus and the United States, as well as relevant OSCE partners for cooperation, to introduce a moratorium on executions as a first step towards full abolition. Mr. Chairman, it is crucial that the need for development of national security-related policies should never negatively affect the rule of law and fundamental freedoms that are at the core of any democratic state. The EU recommends all participating states to review counterterrorism laws and national security-related policies online and offline and reverse all measures that do not live up to OSCE and international commitments. The full statement will be distributed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Center for Civil Liberties, to be followed by the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute. Center for Civil Liberties, you have the floor.
Thank you. The psychotherapeutic work for trauma means, among other interventions, the reconstruction of a personal story. But 8 of 10 stories of our tortured clients contain evidence of the cumulative effect accumulated by their families and communities during the years of the First and Second World Wars, the Holocaust, the Holodomor, ethnic cleansing, expropriations, forced migrations, and Soviet repressions. All of these took lives and crippled the fate of tens of millions of Ukrainians. We recommend to pay precise attention to the following problem: the restoration of dignity as well as mental, physical, and social well-being of people who have been tortured is extremely difficult or unobtainable in the context of declarative reparations and ineffective justice. Articles 11, 12, 13, 14 of the Convention Against Torture are implemented by Ukrainian authorities just formally or aren't implemented at all. The criminal liability for the use of torture of officials is not regulated in the national legislation. NGOs provide access to justice and comprehensive rehabilitation. However, can we reach our goal to eradicate the torture in Ukraine? In fact, we ignore the tragedy taking place within sight of the whole world. Nearly 6 million Ukrainians live in Crimea, annexed by Russian Federation, as well as in the occupied parts of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, without access to justice, adequate medical and social assistance. They are now in information and cultural isolation, subjected to daily attacks by continuous massive toxic propaganda against the permanent background of the prospects of physical annihilation. More than 300 Ukrainian citizens are still held hostage on the territory of Russian Federation and territories uncontrolled by Ukraine. Now they are living evidence of impunity for the evildoers. The current situation forces us to be courageous and urges us not to succumb to the temptation of dramatic avoidant behavior. We are in the midst of events and have the resistance sufficient to call a spade a spade. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute, to be followed by the charity fund Right to Protection. International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute would like to again draw the OSCE's attention to the deteriorating situation of the independence of the legal profession observed in a number of OSCE participating states. Today, lawyers, especially those working on politically sensitive cases, such as torture, are targeted through a variety of ways. Disbarment procedures, license suspension, administrative sanctions, or even criminal prosecution. Governments are also target lawyers through amendments to national laws that aim to effectively take control over the work of lawyers altogether. A notable example is Azerbaijan. The Azerbaijani Bar Association fails to protect its members and rather itself initiates disciplinary proceedings against lawyers. Since 2017, two human rights lawyers, Irada Javadova and Yelchin Imanov, were disbarred because of the statements they made referring to allegations of torture. Just recently, lawyers Adil Ismailov's license was suspended for a year, again for lawyers' critical voice. Lawyer Shahla Gumbatova, who has been defending the famous Azerbaijani blogger Mehman Husseinov, is currently being targeted as well through the disciplinary proceedings by the Azerbaijani Bar Association. Lawyers are also targeted in Central Asian countries. In Tajikistan, lawyers who take up national security and counter-terrorism cases appear to be in particular danger. Based on the definitions of terrorism and extremism in the Tajik legislation, lawyers who defend clients charged with these crimes may become the subject of criminal prosecution of the same or similar crimes themselves. The authorities of Kazakhstan, in politically motivated cases of alleged torture, use intimidation to prevent lawyers from freely and effectively performing their duties. Since 2018, at least 10 lawyers were either disbarred or there were attempts to disbar or disciplinarily punish them. Lawyers often face physical threats or psychological pressure in Kazakhstan in the form of repeated phone calls and text messages from unknown numbers, repeated knocks on the door at night, threats to them and their families. The IBA's Human Rights Institute calls on the Azerbaijan and the Central Asian countries to respect the independence of the legal profession, in particular lawyers' non-identification with their clients principle, seize all harassment and intimidation of lawyers, and adopt the necessary legislative changes ensuring the independence of the legal profession in practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the charity fund Right to Protection, to be followed by the American Bar Association. Charity fund Right to Protection, you have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Elina Shishkina. I'm representing Ukrainian charity fund Right to Protection. Whilst fighting terrorism, the main question arises not only how to ensure national security and protect human rights, but also how to protect individuals who suffer from terrorist acts and anti-terrorist operations, particularly during the armed conflict. Since 2014, responding to the armed aggression of Russian Federation, Ukrainian government has been proceeding countering measures known as anti-terrorist operation. According to official data, during the armed conflict, a significant human loss has taken place in Ukraine. Approximately 13,000 of persons were killed because of Russian aggression. 3,000 among them are civilians. The armed conflict has caused an internal displacement of more than 1.3 million of persons, as well as the destruction or damage of more than 50,000 dwellings in both sides along the contact line. Although the hostilities take place within the Ukrainian territory, the responsibility for damages is laying on the aggressor state that occupied Crimean Peninsula and supports illegal troops in the eastern Ukraine. The actions of Russian Federation are the origin of hostilities, the countering measures that followed, as well as damages that Ukrainian citizens meet with. So, in compliance with the principles and norms of international law, a state aggressor is charged for pecuniary and non-pecuniary damage caused to Ukraine as a result of the armed conflict. Despite the Ukrainian government is currently making a consolidated claim to the government of Russian Federation, the way for victims to get justice through judicial institutions, domestic or international, can be very long. At least some of them won't simply survive until the compensation is paid. For this reason, the Ukrainian NGO Charity Fund Right to Protection suggests to Ukrainian government to elaborate the legislative tools to compensate damages to Ukrainians without waiting reparations from Russia. On the other hand, we demand Russian authorities to take full responsibility for its actions in Ukrainian Crimea and Donbass, in compliance with international obligations, and to make a clear and durable strategy to pay compensation for all victims of its armed aggression in Ukraine. Thank you so much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much. The next speaker is the American Bar Association, to be followed by the political movement Group 24. American Bar Association, you have the floor.
Thank you, moderator. I would like to draw your attention to the role of lawyers. Lawyers play a vital role in upholding the rule of law. They ensure access to justice. They fight violations of human rights, including torture. They are champions of due process and fair trial guarantees. However, lawyers can only effectively fulfill their role as essential agents of the administration of justice if they can practice law freely and independently. We note with concern the increasing lack of respect for the independence of lawyers and the legal profession in the OSCE countries. Member states must ensure that lawyers are able to advise and represent their clients, very often human rights defenders, without restrictions, influence, pressure, or undue interference from any party. There are countries, however, where the entry into or continued practice within the legal profession is conditioned or controlled by the executive branch. There are also other countries where the executive or judicial branches are using disciplinary, civil, and criminal procedures as means of pressure and intimidation of lawyers. Often, lawyers face new re-attestation and certification procedures or disbarment as means to control their abilities to represent human rights defenders in sensitive cases, very often torture cases, or as a tool of punishment for their activities. Lawyers are also identified with their clients or their clients' causes, and as a result, face attacks on their physical integrity and reputation, intimidation, arbitrary prosecutions, and sanctions, including lengthy prison sentences. Frequent and systematic attacks of lawyers have a chilling effect on the whole category of legal practitioners and directly affect the rule of law in a country. Because of the valuable role lawyers play in ensuring the rule of law and acting as a conduit between the public and the legal system, lawyers should be respected and their work valued by the governments and members of the OSCE. We call upon OSCE member states to ensure that lawyers are able to perform all of their professional functions without intimidation, hindrance, harassment, or improper interference in laws and regulations, fully comply with the United Basic Principles on the role of lawyers and other international instruments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I give the floor to the next speaker, just a kind reminder of the topics of this session: prevention of torture, abolition of capital punishment, and protection of human rights, and fighting terrorism. And I would be grateful if speakers can, as much as possible, focus their interventions on these issues. With this, I will now give the floor to the political movement Group 24, to be followed by the Human Rights Center Viasna. Political movement Group 24, you have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am Hussein Ashuruf, Deputy Head of Political Movement and official representative in Sweden. According to today's topic, I would like to say that numerous facts of torture and ill treatment of the dictatorial regime of Imam Ali Rahmanov against political prisoners, oppositions, lawyers, and dissenters are known to all. If the representative of Rahmanov want to prove otherwise, we recommend them to allow the representative of international organization to visit the political prisoners Maqsood Ibrahimov, Umejon Salihov, Buzurgmeher Yorov, and others, so they can make sure with the condition of their detention and state of their health. Regarding to the fight against terrorism and the protection of human rights, I can say that since 2000, Rahmanov's regime is using the phrase fighting against terrorism to terrorize the entire peaceful opposition and civil society of the country in order to transfer the power to his son. Any objective criticism is interpreted as extremism, terrorism, and an attack on the constitutional order in Tajikistan. Many oppositions were convicted with falsified criminal cases under the pretext of fighting terrorism or protecting the constitutional order. All court season of political prisoners were held behind closed doors. The material of criminal cases were classified as confidential. Relatives of the convicts' criminal cases were classified as relatives of the convicts, lawyers, public, and media were not allowed to participate in the trial. Representative of Rahmanov's regime accuse and call us from this rostrum terrorists and extremists, although they don't have any single proof. If they have evidence, we ask them to make material public so that we, the representative of Group 24, could read and understand on what basis they call us extremists and terrorists. We ask the authority of Tajikistan to make public the material of the case according to which Group 24 on October 9, 2014 was declared extremist and its activity were prohibited on the territory of Tajikistan. We ask them to make the material of criminal cases of political prisoners publicly available. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Human Rights Center Viasna, and to be followed by the Center for Development of Democracy and Human Rights. Human Rights Center Viasna, you have the floor.
Belarus is the last country in Europe, the last post-Soviet state where they still have the death penalty. Over the last year, since the last meeting, 4 people were executed. On the 27th of November 2018, we learned that Igor Grishenkov and Semen Verezhnov were shot. On the 13th of June of this year, we heard about the shooting of Alexander Zhudnik and Vyacheslav Sukharko. Despite the fact that the Committee for the Prevention of Torture of the United Nations registered applications from these men and called on Belarus to temporarily suspend the death penalty sentence until the committee issues its final decision, the Belarusian authorities ignored this request. This year, we had 2 more people sentenced to death on the 9th of January 2019. Alexander Asipovich was sentenced to death on the 14th of May of this year. The Supreme Court then struck down his appeal, and he is now on death row. On the 30th of July of this year, yet another sentence, Viktor Balov was sentenced to death. We only learn about these sentences from the relatives of those on death row because this information is not published. This means that Belarus is not upholding its commitments as per the Copenhagen documents. We call on OSCE participating states to somehow influence the Belarusian authorities, and we call on the Belarusian government. Once again, we insist that you abolish the death penalty.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Center for Development of Democracy and Human Rights, to be followed by the Ukrainian Helsinki Human Rights Union. Center for Development of Democracy and Human Rights, you have the floor, please.
Thank you. I'll start with two recommendations. First, strong, consistent, multilateral pressure on the government of Turkmenistan to end enforced disappearances in prisons must be renewed and coordinated among relevant international bodies, including the OSCE, the United Nations, and the EU, and concerned states. Secondly, at the same time, ODIHR and OSCE participating states should redouble their efforts and resources in the field of torture prevention and include enforced disappearances in the scope of their work to combat torture. Enforced disappearances is a grave human rights violation according to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and is a form of inhuman and degrading treatment both for the disappeared and their families, thus falling also under the scope of the UN Convention Against Torture. The crime of enforced disappearances continues unabated in Turkmenistan. The authorities impose this cruel and illegal punishment on people they consider a political threat to their absolute power due to their opinions, influence, or visibility. Since 2002, hundreds of disappearances have occurred in the country. The international campaign Prove They Are Alive has documented over 120 cases. Of these, at least 27 people have died in custody. The true number of people forcibly disappeared and who have died in custody is no doubt much, much higher. The prison terms of over a dozen individuals on the list have already expired or will expire in 2019 and 20, including those of Konstantin Shikhmuradov and Anagildiak Muradov this autumn. This makes the issue of disappearances more urgent than ever. The fate of these individuals is unknown, except that of a civic activist, Gulgildiana Niyazov, who instead of being released in March 2019 after having served his full 11-year prison sentence, was transferred from prison to a remote place of internal exile where he is living in terrible conditions. Special attention to this group could mean the difference between life and death, as there is a high risk that they will receive new prison terms on fabricated charges. Since September last year, the limited but positive trend with some initial steps by the Turkmen government on dialogue with the UN Working Group on Enforced Disappearances and providing visitations to a handful of prisoners in the notorious Obadan Depe prison has reversed when public pressure was replaced with a quite diplomatic dialogue. The Turkmen government re-entrenched its positions, abruptly ended dialogue with the UN Working Group, and did not include any of the relevant UPR commitments in the work plan. As in the past, the state has failed to disclose information about the disappeared, has not implemented relevant decisions by international bodies, and instead simulates an ineffective dialogue with international organizations. It is high time to stop this game and the barbaric practice of disappearing people to end. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for also starting your intervention with recommendations. Now the next speaker is the Ukrainian Helsinki Human Rights Union, to be followed by Bewegung Gleiche Möglichkeiten für allen. Ukrainian Helsinki Human Rights Union, you have the floor.
I will present situation with medical care for prisoners in Ukraine. Since 2017, the government started a reform of penitentiary system, including a reform of prison medical system. The medical staff was dematerialized, and they has been taken out from subordination to the prisons administration. However, the reform has not given the improvement of medical care for prisoners. But this was the first step of the reform, and the next one, as it planned, will be to transfer of functions of medical care for the inmates from the Ministry of Justice to the Ministry of Health. Now, the main objective factors hindering to providing of medical treatment remain the same. It's a lack of medical staff, underfunding, old and insufficient medical equipment. In reality, the medical staff became to be in subordination of prison administration, at least on the level of medical units. But from the other hand, the prison administration became considered to be not responsible for the health of the prisoners, notwithstanding that the law provide this responsibility of the prisons administration. Lack of medical staff and medicines, old methods of treatment, old equipment, poor physical conditions of medical units and hospital prevents to provide the proper diagnosis and treatment, particularly surgery. Due to this situation with medical care for inmates is bad, and in many institutions is just catastrophic. However, the main obstacle is not all these factors, but the attitude of the medical staff to the prisoners. The staff do not want to treat them, and it's in some sort of stigma to the prisoners as criminals. Many prisoners are without any medical treatment, and in July 2019, the European Court passed judgments against Ukraine, where victims were recognized in 20 situations. Thank you, and I invite all the persons to the room 1 for the side events. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is the Bewegung Gleiche Möglichkeiten für allen, followed by Salute et Miséricorde. Bewegung Gleiche Möglichkeiten für allen, you have the floor.
Уважаемые коллеги.
Dear colleagues, authoritarian states often use the term terrorism when they want to combat people in civil society, and Muslims in particular, who think differently. The special services of Uzbekistan are doing this not just within the borders of the country, but beyond that. Abdul Batai, the leader of the Islamic Renaissance Party, has disappeared. He was kidnapped, in fact, and there's no word of him. A religious leader, Berdizayev, was kidnapped in Tashkent in 1995, and to this day there is no information about him. The Uzbek secret services have engaged in such actions not just within the country but outside. A religious leader, Karik Kamalov, a citizen of Kyrgyzstan, living in Kyrgyzstan, and in 2015, under the pressure of the Uzbek secret services, this imam was sentenced to 10 years. He was an ethnic Uzbek. Initially, the sentence was only 5 years, but that was increased to 10. So I would call on Uzbek authorities to stop the prosecution of Muslims. I mean, they are of the same faith. How can you persecute your brothers and sisters, throwing them into prison and pretending that this is an anti-terrorism action? I would call on the OSCE to draw up a list of countries that support state terrorism and to apply economic sanctions against those states. Thank you for your attention.
The next speaker is Salute et Miséricorde, to be followed by the Institute of Legal Policy and Social Protection, named in the honor of Irina Biryozhna. Salute et Miséricorde, you have the floor, please.
Malgré peut-être les apparences.
Despite appearances, what I am going to be talking about speaks to the issue at hand. It underpins it, in fact. Oh dear has so far been unable to answer the question that I've been asking here for 3 years in a row, no more so than any other international organization. I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that there's no definition of what is a human being, which is necessary in order to be able to protect human rights. Therefore, what we see is arbitrary interpretations, very often based on age. For instance, the French Republic this summer considered the possibility of extending the legal period when you can have an abortion from the 12th to the 14th week of pregnancy. So how is it that someone who we currently believe to be a human being, starting from the 12th week of pregnancy, and therefore this person cannot be killed, how can it be that tomorrow this human being will no longer be considered one? Well, if you cast your minds back, you'll see that France has often argued that it is defending women's rights to do as they see fit with their bodies. But they're actually dodging the question because they're not speaking to the bodies, women's bodies. What this is actually all about is the body of the child. After all, the child is human. It has singular human DNA.
On the topic.
Yes, this is the basis of the topic. Donc, la justification.
So the justification for legalizing this murder, well, it's can be done starting from week 10 in Portugal, week 14 in Germany, and week 24 in the UK. Shouldn't human beings not all be accorded the same dignity? After all, they're all human. Can't you see that this legalization of abortion runs foul of human rights? You see, this is not a trifling matter. After all, what constitutes a human being is in fact the very bedrock of what we use to defend certain rights. In fact, it speaks to the credibility, or rather the monstrous hypocrisy of human rights defenders who want to abolish the death penalty for the guilty, but justify the death penalty for the most innocent of all beings. The precautionary principle states that if in doubt, we should stay well away. As there's no universal recognition of what a human being is, I believe that all attempts to legalize abortion should cease. Thank you.
Thank you. And now the next speaker is the Institute of Legal Policy and Social Protection, to be followed by Public Foundation Kilim Shami. Institute of Legal Policy and Social Protection, you have the floor.
I'm the head of the Ukrainian Institute of Legal Policy and Social Protection, named in the honor of Irina Berezhna. The subject of our discussion is first and foremost the prevention of torture, and I would like to give an example of a physical and mental pressure put on a judge by a neo-Nazi in accordance with the International Convention. This amounts to torture. In April 2015, in Kiev, in front of the home of this judge, a well-known Ukrainian journalist and writer was killed by two neo-Nazis, and then the report on this was published on the internet site, and there was calls for liquidation of other individuals. And then the head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs opened a criminal investigation, and two members of a nationalist organization, C14, Anna Medvedka and another, one of whom worked within the Ministry of Internal Affairs, were charged. And now the actions of these perpetrators were qualified as a deliberate murder and also secret or illegal possession of weapons. They were in fact in detention only for a few months. Neo-Nazis of various groupings came to the court hearings, put pressure on the judge, blocked exit from the courtroom, threatened the judge and his family members, and as a result, these individuals were released. They could leave the territory of Ukraine, and they were subject to no punishment for the murder. 4 years have passed, and yet the case has still not fully been heard, and the commissioner of the murder has not been identified. And no single action has been taken, no declaration has been made about this crime, as opposed to Rudkovsky, the previous human rights commissioner, who did this in Ukraine. There has been a refusal to take up the case in certain Ukrainian courts. And Sidorov, a judge who was responsible for this, I mean, this is not an isolated example. I'm giving you this as one example. whenever neo-Nazis commit crimes because of pressure, and this amounts to a form of torture, judges do not hand down sentences, and there is full impunity. So I would call for Ukraine to fulfill the 2017 resolution of the European Parliament about preventing neo-Nazism in the countries of Europe. Thank you.
We are discussing at this session. The next speaker is the Public Foundation Kilim Shami, to be followed by the NGO Anti-Fascist Human Rights League. Public Foundation Kilim Shami, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, my recommendations. First of all, we call on ODIHR to recognize women and children which were involved in the Syrian conflict as victims of the Syrian war, as victims of radical extremism and the terrorist conflict. That's number one. Number two, we call on ODIHR OSCE to raise this issue at the UN Security Council. Third, we call on ODIHR to call on the Islamic Republic of Iraq not to implement death penalty sentences which have been meted out to female convicts in Iraqi prisons. 4, we call on OSCE participating states where there are women, which have women and children on Syrian territory in Iraqi prisons. In fact, everything should be done in order to bring them home, all the while safeguarding their rights. Moving on, I call on my homeland, the Republic of Kyrgyzstan, to expedite the process of returning women and children back home. This should be done before the onset of winter, so as to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe. And last but not least, I want to thank Kazakhstan, which is an example which other countries should emulate. Kazakhstan should allow other international human rights organizations to visit the country so as to learn from the experience of your country. As I still have some time left, I want to say the following. Many might be aware that in the northeast of Syria, as things stand, there are 4 camps. And in those camps, there are roughly 75,000 women and children. And they hail from over 80 countries. The women and the children are not to blame. They're victims. The conditions there are dire. There are orphans there, children who've been wounded, sick women. Since August, as far as I'm aware, infectious disease has spread through the camps. So we need to bring these people home as soon as possible. These are our women. They are not to blame. Women are not to blame for this war. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is the NGO Anti-Fascist Human Rights League, to be followed by Pantarei Foundation. NGO Anti-Fascist Human Rights League, you have the floor.
I would like to draw attention to the fact that according to the UN Human Rights Commissioner in Ukraine, there have been a number of cases of torture and inhuman treatment of individuals because of the conflict in the east of Ukraine in Donbass. There have been illegal judicial proceedings with certain individuals being handed over to these volunteer battalions, and the UN Human Rights Commissioner has identified cases of inhuman treatment in prisons. And it's very difficult to obtain hard and fast information because of lack of access. Now, violence starts from the time of the search and the detention of the individual. When law and order officers enter the person's home. Alexei Samolov in Kharkov, for instance, after detention, was so badly beaten that when he was taken to court, the signs of the violence were still visible on his face. I mean, his nose had been broken. He was unrecognizable. The director of Elena Berezhnaya, from the group that we've already heard from, was also beaten on the occasion of the search of her home. The Court gave permission for this. Her door was broken in. She lost consciousness, and in the absence of a lawyer, a so-called investigator carried out a search of the apartment, and then subsequently, in fact, the apartment was looted. And then a report was submitted to the General Prosecutor and the Anti-Corruption Office. Criminal proceedings were open, but that was not followed up, and therefore there was no reaction from the Human Rights Ombudsman or from the Supreme Court. I would also like to mention that when a client of mine was detained, a well-known journalist, Morawiecki, he was detained in his home during the birth of his first child, and then subsequently psychological pressure was put on him. He was told that if he doesn't sign documents admitting to guilt, then there would be certain consequences. There's also a problem with the lack of medical care in Ukrainian prisons. Some of them were built at the time of the Russian Empire, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There's no heating. There are no appropriate conditions, and just to be there is already torture. Thank you for your attention.
Given the limited time, it would be helpful to formulate clearly and to maybe start from the recommendations, as I mentioned also at the beginning of the session. Now, the next speaker is the Pantarei Foundation, to be followed by an independent civil society activist from Tajikistan. Pantarei Foundation, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Michael Specjalski. I'm the Vice President of the Pantarei Foundation, a Polish organization helping Poles abroad and defending human rights in Europe. I will speak on behalf of the board, President Maja Ruben, but especially parents and children from Poland and other countries whose human rights and to private and family life and the right to express their own views regarding the child matters in administrative and judicial proceedings are being violated in the judicial process of the Hague Convention on the civil aspects of international child abductions. And our recommendation: we recommend Andorra, Croatia, Denmark, Cyprus, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Netherlands, and Great Britain to adjust their national criminal law to the obligation of Article 8 of the European Convention of Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms by decriminalization of the so-called parental child abductions, changing the criminal law according to majority of the
Apologies for the interruption. Again, I'm reminded of the topic of the session, which is torture, human rights in the fight against terrorism.
Yes, this is human rights.
In the fight against terrorism and the death penalty. So these are the topics. I would be grateful if you could focus on these topics.
Yes, OSCE cancelled other topics, so this is only the topic that can bring the human rights. So if I can continue, thank you. By decriminalization of so-called parental child abductions, changing their criminal law according to the majority of the OSCE countries and parties of the Convention for Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, to not punish or to punish only parents who have limited parental rights. The second recommendation to OSCE states that are parties of the Hague Convention on Civil Aspects of International Child Abductions regarding the practice of the courts not using the Conventional Rights of the Child but not interviewing the child during the cases, we recommend to implement Article 10, 12 and 13 of the Convention of the Rights of the Child directly in their acts regarding the issues for obligatory hearings for the child.
I'm really sorry, I have to, this is completely out of topic.
Excuse me.
So I would now proceed to the next speaker, which is the independent civil society activist.
Excuse me, OSCE change.
Yes, thank you very much.
Can I have my 20 seconds?
I'm sorry, it is my decision to now give the floor to the next speaker, the independent civil society activist from Tajikistan, to be followed by Ukraine. Independent civil society activist from Tajikistan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. My name is Ms. Adudotova. I'm an independent human rights activist from Tajikistan. A wife of a man who was sentenced to life in prison. In fact, he's the deputy of an organization banned in Tajikistan. She petitioned the ombudsman. She reported that her husband was being tortured in detention. On the 9th of March of this year, someone met with her husband, and they reported that he is, in fact, Mr. Haitov, that is, and that he is being tortured so that he can give testimony against the Islamic Renaissance Party. However, he refused to do so, although they did threaten to torture him. Before he said goodbye to his loved ones, he said that it's unlikely that he will survive the torture he's been subjected to. He also said that his whole body is covered in wounds. In February, he had a heart attack. For 10 days, he was terribly sick, and they refused to hand over the medicines his relatives had brought to the prison to him. Tajikistan, in fact, forced him to sign a statement according to which he's not been tortured by the prison administration. He agreed to write this, but he actually said that he was not tortured on the day when he wrote that letter, on the 11th of September. Last year, a UN group on arbitrary arrest called on Dushanbe to immediately release this man, who's 66 years old. In March of this year, 9 human rights organizations such as Freedom House, Freedom Now, Human Rights Watch, and the Norwegian Helsinki Committee also demanded for the Tajikistani authorities to release Mr. Haidt. Nonetheless, the government of Tajikistan has no intention of doing so. I therefore call on OSCE delegations, including the USA and the EU, to please go and visit Mr. Haitov and other political prisoners, and also to fight for the ICIC to also get access to those being detained in Tajikistan. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Ukraine, to be followed by the Azerbaijan Institute for Democracy and Human Rights. Ukraine, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. At the outset, I would like to thank the introducer for her thought-provoking presentation. Then I would like to move on to recommendations. So Ukraine recommend OSCE ODIHR together with the civil society and participating states to work out the multilateral mechanism to prevent and prosecute perpetrators of torture in the situation of foreign occupation. Ukraine recommends special monitoring mission in Ukraine to monitor, including distantly, the cases of torture and ill treatment in temporarily occupied Ukrainian Crimea and certain areas of Donbass. Ukraine recommends and demands from the Russian Federation to stop practices of torture and ill treatment in the occupied territories of Ukraine, as well as illegal transfer of Ukrainian citizens from the occupied territories to Russia. We also would like to recommend Russian Federation to stop misuse of anti-terrorist and anti-extremist legislation against human rights defenders, civic journalists, religious minorities in Russian Federation and in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine and Georgia. Ukraine is a party to all international legal instruments aimed at eradication of torture. Strict implementation of these instruments shall be the measure of the true commitment of Ukrainians to human rights and democratic values. The Ukrainian state is cooperating effectively with the UN Subcommittee on Prevention of Torture and the European Committee of the Prevention of Torture, and is focusing its efforts on the prevention of torture in the places of deprivation of liberty. The Russian Federation, as an aggressor state for over 5 consecutive years, has been committing crimes against the citizens of Ukraine on a daily basis, resorting to torture, psychological pressure on illegally detained and convicted Ukrainian citizens, both in the territory of the Russian Federation and on the temporarily occupied territories of my state that are distinguished participants are mostly much more closer than your respective capitals from Warsaw. Regular monitoring by established specialized international mechanism with regards to the principles of unimpeded access to all places of detention and fully privacy of interviewers with all detainees in the temporarily occupied territories are still impossible and been rejected by Russia and its occupation administrations. I thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you. The next speaker is the Azerbaijan Institute for Democracy and Human Rights, to be followed by Kazakhstan. Azerbaijan Institute for Democracy and Human Rights, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ahmad Shadov, I represent Azerbaijan Institute for Democracy and Human Rights. Today I want to talk about the torture, penalty, and human rights and fighting against terrorism. And before my speech, I highly appreciate the recent exchange of captives and hostages between Ukraine and Russia. And as a human rights defender, I welcome to continue this humanitarian act in the near future. As a human rights defender from Azerbaijan, I want to mention that my country, Azerbaijan, is also suffering from the issue of captives and hostages. And since 1988, we have lost almost 4,000 Azerbaijanis during Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, and Azerbaijan is always raising this issue in international platforms. As a human rights defender, I personally have raised the issue of Azerbaijani captives and hostages in OSCE meeting in Warsaw and Vienna. Personally, I'm defending the rights of two Azerbaijani citizens. They are Dilgam Askarov and Shahbaz Guliyev, who was detained by Armenian army in 2014 and sentenced to 22 years and life imprisonment. Today I want to propose a very humanitarian act because last week official Baku has proposed to exchange the captives and hostages between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and as a human rights defender I call all participants here, all member states and members of civil society.
I'm sorry, once again, apologies for interruption. Can you please conclude with focus on the topics at hand?
Okay,
Thank you.
Regarding the topics, now two Armenian prisoners was detained in Azerbaijani sand, and official Baku has proposed to exchange these persons. And I called the Armenian representative to positively respond.
I'm sorry,
to this
I also object to the display of photographs of individuals. We don't know if we have their consent.
We are here
this is
a
live
big
stream.
family, and I think it's in our hands to make happy their families. And if we can, how to say, to achieve the exchange of the captives and hostages between the Armenia and Azerbaijan as OSCE, as a ODIHR, as a OSCE Minsk group, we can make ourselves happy and to be sure that we can solve these little problems.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Kazakhstan, to be followed by the Tajik Center for Human Rights. Kazakhstan, you have the floor, please.
Good afternoon, dear participants. Over the last few years in the Republic of Kazakhstan, very large-scale work has been done to come up with new legislation that would be in accordance with international standards in the interests of our people. Enshrinement of the principle of the rule of law is of great interest to civil society. We need legislative acts of a new generation, and this is being worked on. The torture, of course, is completely prohibited in accordance with our international standards. There are investigations of claims of torture. We have an independent institute to monitoring. There is a national commission to prevent torture, which is fully independent. And only individuals who are truly dangerous to society are kept in isolation. Now, with more humanization of prisons, this is not something that can result in more torture. You cannot give amnesty to anyone who has been sentenced to prison for torture. 12 years of imprisonment is a maximum sentence for torture, and support is provided to the victims. If anyone is in fact subject to torture, then they can be freed from criminal liability for their crimes. We have an electronic system of tracing actions by police officers, and thanks to the improvement in the criminal code, we have managed to close down 12 of our prison camps, and we have improved greatly when it comes to our ranking on the treatment of prisoners. We have also improved our position on the rule of law index. The Republic of Kazakhstan is orienting its efforts to work further on protecting fundamental rights of citizens. The full text of my statement will be made available to the Secretariat. Thank you.
Human rights, to be followed by Human Rights Movement, Bearduino, Kyrgyzstan. Tajik Center for Human Rights. You have the floor.
Vielen Dank, Herr Moderator. Ich heiße Sulaiman Orziev.
Thank you very much, moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, as things stand, many government representatives have spoken to the topic of terrorism and people who they deem to be terrorists or extremists. You see, in fact, these are often dissidents and human rights defenders whose freedoms are being trampled. In Tajikistan, there's the Islamic Renaissance Party. There are other parties, but none of them have been engaged in any extremist activities. Not since the 1990s. It is, in fact, the government itself which is committing extremist and terrorist acts. And there's, in fact, one important fact which you need to be made aware of. If any one of us visited Iran, for instance, we are immediately branded as terrorists. If one of us visits an Arab state, then we are called Salafists, extremists, and so on and so forth. And yet today, we're here in Europe. And we, people hailing from Tajikistan, we've been told that we are not believers, that we are taking our daily bread from the hands of those who are not believers, and that our arms and legs should be broken. That's what we were told by Dushanbe. Fortunately, none of this has happened. So far, we've been accused of taking part in extremist and terrorist activities. But what do you think? When the government has tarnished and is tarnishing our reputation in this fashion, what does the future hold, both for political parties in Tajikistan and for independent activists? Clearly, we're in danger. We're being denied the right to exercise our freedom of expression. We're actually against extremism and terrorism. What we want is to see a democratic regime in Tajikistan. Just 5 more seconds. 5 more seconds. By way of conclusion, we want to be able to exercise our rights in a democratic country, in Tajikistan. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a reminder to those representatives of participating states that they wish to exercise their right of reply. My colleagues at the back are maintaining a list of those interventions, and we will have time, as usual, at the end of this session for that. Now, the next speaker is the Human Rights Movement Bearduino, Kyrgyzstan, to be followed by the Human Rights Center. Human Rights Movement Bearduino, Kyrgyzstan, you have the floor.
Dear participants of the conference, on an annual basis, Kyrgyzstan engages in hundreds of cases of human rights violations. This is done by human rights organizations. We provide legal defense to victims of torture. At the present, we have 25 of them whom we are representing. Now, knowing the situation of victims of torture, we believe it is necessary for our government to recognize the right to life and to not being tortured when in detention. In 2014 to 2019, 154 people have died in places of detention, and in 2018 there was suicide committed by a number of detainees, and others died in dubious circumstances. We also believe that it is essential to respect the rights of people who have been sentenced under general law. In many cases, they are not provided with requisite medical care. And a particularly vulnerable group is the individuals who are suspected, accused, or even found guilty of extremist activity or terrorism. They are subject to torture by officers of the National Security Agency. They are often kept in isolation. with no access to other individuals. There is also a big problem with respecting the rights of young offenders, minors in fact, who are in prison camp number 14. For instance, in the report of the Ombudsman for 2018, it is reported that in prison camp number 14 for minors, there are, in fact, children kept in isolation for the commission of some minor offense. So we insist that the government should fully investigate all claims of torture, bring to justice the perpetrators, to make sure that such investigations are dealt with in a timely manner from the moment of their lodging or their registration, and that there also be submission of all of these claims of torture to the Prosecutor General, and that they be dealt with appropriately. Thank you.
And Prosperity. Human Rights Center, you have the floor.
Thank you, moderator. At the outset, I should like to inform you that outside the plenary hall, you have documents setting forth the torture situation in Central Asia in extenso. There's information about individuals who were allegedly tortured in Kazakhstan and Tajikistan. This statement was prepared by a coalition against torture in a number of Central Asian countries, as well as a number of NGOs, such as the Turkmen Human Rights Initiative, the Polish Helsinki Group as well. Cases of electrocution, rape, beatings, all of this is continuing in Central Asia. This is a tragedy, not only to the people being tortured, but also a tragedy for their relatives and the international community. Civil society plays a vital role, providing support to victims, also by issuing recommendations, taking part in international human rights fora. Thanks to the efforts of these organizations, some dozen victims have now obtained justice. A number of the perpetrators have been brought to justice, and some of the victims have received compensation in a number of countries. However, in many Central Asian countries, the civil society space is shrinking, and civil society organizations run many risks. To put an end with inhuman and degrading treatment and torture, we need to take stock of the extent of the problem, to publish statistics about specific cases, investigations, and also have independent monitors looking at the situation. We need an independent mechanism for complaints. As I said, you have the full report just outside this room. As for recommendations, we believe that the Coalition Against Torture, Tajikistan, currently has some access to places of detention, but this access is limited. We want unimpeded access so that we can double-check all of the information that we're receiving about abuses in places of detention. This is information that seeps through in the media. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next speaker is Rights and Prosperity, to be followed by the Human Rights Development Center. Rights and Prosperity, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. Talking about torture and inhuman treatment in Tajikistan, I'd like to touch on two aspects of this. First of all, that we need to have a constant improvement of the legislation. It needs to be brought up to international standards. And in this respect, there are some positive developments that have been taken by the government. In my statement, I would like to make a recommendation concerning the enforcement in practice of the prevailing recommendation. The first recommendation is that there be an independent mechanism for investigating claims of torture and cruel or inhuman punishment. Such claims are often submitted for investigation to the individuals who are suspect as perpetrators. And this, of course, makes no sense. They're sent to the same entity of the prosecutor that was prosecuting the individual in question, that was charging the individual in question. I think it's also important that appropriate compensation be paid to victims of torture or to their family members if they die, and that such compensation be proportionate to the actual harm caused to the victims and not be a function of the budgets available to the entities for which the perpetrators worked, and that there also be public apologies made when torture occurs. We need to give further support to civil society organizations in Tajikistan. Such support should be given to civil society groups by Tajikistan on a long-term basis in order that they be able to provide assistance to victims of torture. Then there's also the issue of state protection for individuals participating in legal proceedings. Now, in theory, this is already the case, but in practice, the defense of victims of torture is in the hands of individuals who are closely related to those who committed the torture. And if the torturers are not detained, they can put pressure on the victim of torture and family members in order not to lose legal cases brought against them.
The United States of America, Human Rights Development Center, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I would like to present myself. My name is Vogar Ahmadov. I am from Human Rights Development Center. In my speech, I would like to touch upon the issue of fighting with terrorism. It's a very actual topic, and Azerbaijan is very active in fighting with extremism, terrorism. Was in a coalition with the United States and other countries in counterterrorism operation in Afghanistan, Iraq. But from another another side, Azerbaijan has faced with extremism and terrorism. As you know, there is a conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Armenian extremist groups still keep under the occupation the 20% of Azerbaijani lands, and despite of the interference of international community, international organizations, still there is no result, and 1 million refugees and still internal displaced people, IDPs, they still...
Sorry, there is a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The statement that we are hearing right now has nothing to do with the agenda and the discussions, with the content of discussion, and I would like to bring this to your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, may I continue?
Thank you very much.
I will talk about another case, about the human rights case.
Focus on the
about
topics
fighting
at
with
hand.
terrorism, because in our countries there is today, I would like to draw your attention to the very threatening issue in our country, because together with political opposition in social media platform, today we have a new trend like radical religious groups who are using social media and threatening the authorities, the public, to create instability in the country. And last year, after the presidential election in Azerbaijan, we saw the case how in the second city of Azerbaijan, in Ganja, there was an attempt, there was a gun attack to the head of local authority, and he almost lost his life as a result of this attack. And today, this religious group using the social media platforms. These radical groups these are people who are trained in Syria, in Syria, and this is a really serious danger. And hopefully, I call all international community, all international organizations to fight, and indirectly the activists who were just answered to this call and went to the streets in Ganja, they sentenced to 10 years to 15 years. This is also a human rights case, and I hope Azerbaijani courts will look at this issue again, and will thank you for your attention.
Thank you. The next speaker is the United States of America, to be followed by the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan. United States of America, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. This is the position of the United States regarding torture. Torture and cruel and inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment are prohibited everywhere and at all times. The United States plays a leading role in combating torture around the world, including through our strong support for civil society organizations. We recognize participating states share the goals of countering terrorism and violent extremism, and commend the progress in certain countries in advancing these goals in ways that are consistent with respect for human rights. We're concerned that laws against so-called extremism and hate speech are increasingly misused in some countries to unduly restrict freedom of expression, to repress political dissent, or to interfere with the exercise of the freedom of religion or belief. In 2018, the U.S. Special Rapporteur on Torture stated allegations of torture and mistreatment of those in police custody in Turkey have increased since December 2016. We urge Turkey to enforce its own laws and adhere to its international obligations and commitment prohibiting torture and promoting a law enforcement culture that upholds and protects human rights. In December, the United States welcomed the compelling report of the Moscow Mechanism, the Moscow Mechanism mission on serious human rights violations and abuses in Russia's Republic of Chechnya. The report concluded that local Chechnyan authorities committed torture, extrajudicial killings, and other serious human rights violations against persons on the basis of their sexual orientation. That there's a climate of impunity, which means, of course, that the state allows people to get away with it, and that the Russian government appears to support the perpetrators. The United States has imposed sanctions under the Russia Magnitsky Act on multiple Chechnyan officials. We call on other participating states to do the same. Since the publication of the Moscow Mechanism, credible allegations of unlawful detention and torture in Chechnya have emerged. In light of the information, we call on Russia once again to deal with this. Turning to capital punishment. While we respect the views of those who advocate for the abolition of the death penalty or moratorium in its use, we note capital punishment is a legally available punishment under international law in appropriate cases and reserved as punishment only for the most heinous murders in the United States. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you. The next speaker is the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan, to be followed by Musoidat. Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan, you have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, combating terrorism and extremism is often used by the government of Tajikistan to put pressure on political opponents, restricting their freedom of expression and the rights of citizens. The authorities use every pretext, every opportunity, including terrorist acts, to impose certain restrictions, to block internet sites. A striking example are the tragic events of last year when 6 bicycle terrorists were killed. This tragedy was taken advantage of by the authorities. In just a few hours, they announced that it was our party that stood behind this terrorist act. But just a bit later, everyone knew the details, and it was clear that this terrible, horrible crime was committed by another group. But the victims of the terrorist attack were Western terrorists, and so that resulted in a very negative reaction. So the authorities tried to convince the international community that the opposition was involved in this terrorist attack, but unfortunately no one believed them. Now, even after this international propaganda failure, the authorities are continuing this practice. It is not coincidental that in this conference, on at least 10 occasions, the authorities of the country have leveled charges of extremism and terrorism against our party. And they never talked about the Agila, even though 2,000 citizens of Tajikistan are members of the Agila, which has nothing to do with us. They are distributing falsified documentation about the opposition in the country on the occasion of this conference. We have here this newspaper where my handshake with the leader of Iran is put forward as evidence of participation in terrorism. And in this newspaper, in this periodical, there is also a photograph of the Afghani Minister of Foreign Affairs, and they simply took a photograph of him through Photoshop, and they're claiming that this indicates that I have met with terrorists. So the authorities are involved in combating political opponents and not terrorists or extremists. So we would call on the OSCE to trigger the Moscow mechanism and to have a report on the torture of political opponents and the prohibition of opposition political parties in Tajikistan.
Musaidat, you have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Rahim Kamarimov. I'm from Tajikistan. Civil society in Tajikistan stands convinced that in order for international organizations to effectively combat violent extremism and radicalism, it is necessary to avoid using double standards. We are seriously concerned by the fact that there are some terrorist and religious extremist organizations in Tajikistan which are using the fig leaf of democracy. Using the fig leaf of democracy, they're attending international fora, international conferences, and promoting their religious extremist views and ideologies there. We regret, we as representatives of civil society in Tajikistan, that outside Tajikistan, at various international conferences organized by reputable international organizations, there are representatives of that terrorist and extremist organization, the Islamic Renaissance Party. The activities of that party have been banned by the Supreme Court of Tajikistan. Today, we've seen a new association of religious and extremist groups come to the fore. They're using international fora, international meetings and conferences in order to promote their destructive anti-Tajikistani agenda. This is a cause for serious concern on the part of Tajikistani society. Civil society in Tajikistan strongly condemns the dogged calls of the leaders of this new association of Tajikistani religious, radical, and extremist organizations, a call to overthrow the constitutional order in Tajikistan and to establish a religious state.
The next speaker is the Russian Federation, to be followed by Tajikistan. Russian Federation, you have the floor.
Thank you, moderator, distinguished members of the conference. The Russian Federation does not apply the most extreme form of punishment. Now, unfortunately, despite the fact that there are a lot of OSCE obligations when it comes to preventing torture, cruel, and inhuman treatment, the situation in this respect continues to be very worrisome. With references to the need to counteract so-called Russian aggression and separatism, Ukraine is persecuting political opponents, independent journalists, and media companies, as well as civil society leaders. On the pretext of combating terrorism, the U.S. authorities disproportionately and indiscriminately deploy military force on the territory of third-party states in violation of the norms of international humanitarian law, and as a result of so-called anti-terrorist operations, peaceful citizens are losing their lives. The continued existence of the Guantanamo prison is a striking example of American double standards in the field of human rights. There are still dozens of prisoners there, and most of them have not even been charged or offered fair judicial proceedings. Furthermore, those responsible for these actions have not been brought to justice. The extreme form of punishment in this state is often applied in ways that are comparable to torture. We are very concerned by the fact that the American authorities, after a 16-year break, are returning to the use of capital punishment at the federal level. According to data from publicly available sources, at the present time, 62 prisoners in the United States have been sentenced to capital punishment in the United States, and 5 of them are to be put to death by January of 2020. This has been very much criticized by civil society because capital punishment is characterized by racial prejudice and official crimes committed by the prosecution. In Canada, there's a practice of segregating prisoners by ethnic group in prisons and keeping them in isolation cells for the long time. Now, in the context of today's team, we cannot fail to mention that on the territory of some European Union member states, there were secret CIA prisons in which torture and other forms of inhuman treatment were current practice. In particular, there was the European Court of Human Rights decision in May of 2018. 2 decisions, in fact, Abu Zubaydah against Lithuania and Al-Nashir against Romania, in which it was stated that both individuals were kept under a rendition program in secret CIA prisons. Now, these decisions have not been executed thanks to sabotage by the United States. I would like to stress the fact that combating terrorism must be done in a way that is consistent with international standards. Thank you for your attention. The full text of our statement will be made available to the Secretariat.
Union. Tajikistan, you have the floor.
Mr. Moderator, distinguished participants, my government has been doing its utmost to fulfill its human rights obligations, including within the framework of the UN Committee for the Prevention of Torture. Some of the people speaking here, in fact, the UN representative visited our country twice, and in their report, they said that they were satisfied with the systematic approach the government has adopted to implementing the UN's recommendations. In terms of that recommendation from the UNCPT for the period 2012-2020, major steps forward included the introduction of punishments and sanctions for torture. Torture is now considered a crime. Almost all official government websites make it available for anyone and everyone to lodge a complaint and to report instances of torture. Of course, it is the Public Prosecutor's Office that addresses cases of torture. We also have established a monitoring group to keep an eye on the issue. The Convention Against Torture is something we're implementing, and we also have a national preventive mechanism that we set up in line with that convention. It's also one of the recommendations of the UNCPT. Moving on, in terms of the guarantees contained in the procedure, in 2016, we introduced major changes to our legislation in this sphere. Thus, if we, for instance, conduct counterterrorism activities, we must uphold fundamental freedoms. A terrorist attack occurred several years ago, targeting foreign tourists, a Dutchman, an American, a Swiss national, and a few other people suffered in that terrorist attack. This is considered a serious crime. This was a terrorist attack organized by the Islamic Renaissance Party on behalf of ISIS. We've brought the victims to justice, all the while respecting their rights. The Code of Criminal Procedure provides for safeguards, safeguarding the rights of the accused, even those accused of terrorism. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is the Reformist Youth Public Union, to be followed by the Tajik Cultural Center of Samonyon in Kazakhstan. Reformist Youth Public Union, you have the floor.
Thank you, moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, Zenfira Aliyeva from Azerbaijan. As my current residence country, Turkey, has been facing and fighting against the terrorism problem over 40 years, as a lawyer who lives in Turkey, I totally can say within this subject, protection and promotion of human rights are among Turkey's indispensable priorities. Some reports published by non-governmental organizations in some countries contain unfounded allegations, dubious information, and biased interpretations. Turkish people observe with disappointment that in these reports, they once again fail to recognize Turkey's rightful fight against brutal terrorist organizations, in particular PKK, FETÖ, Daesh, and DHKPC. These reports haven't refrained from portraying Turkey's counter-terrorism efforts to ensure national and regional security, executed in full compliance with international law and human rights, as human rights violations. It is absolutely unacceptable for those responsible of thousands of civilian casualties in the course of operations across the world to accuse the Turkish armed forces, which have gained even the appreciation of the people of the region, that they liberated without harm to any civilians during all the operations of civil casualties. I just really wonder, how is it that many countries can accept terrorists from the PKK and FETÖ? How is it that these countries can shelter PKK supporters, executives, and head of FETÖ? These attitudes are not fair and also risky for their citizens too. I have to say that in Turkey, for many years, there are terrorists masked by different professional activities other than the accustomed terrorist image. That's why Turkey has been under heavy threat and taken necessary precautions against terrorism in a democratic manner. And saying that these measures are against human rights constitutes treason and attack on the rights of civilian citizens. Is it clear that these reports and attitudes, which is far from being objective, has been shaped by political incentives of them? So, human rights shouldn't be politicized. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is the Tajik Cultural Center of Samonyon in Kazakhstan, to be followed by NGO sociologists. Tajik Cultural Center, you have the floor.
Mr. Moderator, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, terrorism is a very serious threat for democracy and human rights. Now, of course, states need to pretend terrorist attacks and to punish severely when they are committed. But state security and the rule of law have to be put in an appropriate balance. In many countries of the world, combating terrorism and extremism is a huge problem. Terrorist and extremist organizations use certain gaps in the legislation of countries of the world to commit their crimes and to avoid punishment for those crimes. We Tajiks living in Kazakhstan consider the Islamic Renaissance Party and its supporters like the Group 24 and others that are seeking to destabilize the peaceful lives of Tajiks in Kazakhstan. In January of this year, the law and order forces of Kazakhstan detained 5 individuals who were going from Tajikistan to Kazakhstan with a view to carrying out terrorist attacks. There is other evidence that the Islamic Renaissance Party and others have cells in Western European states and are recruiting individuals to engage in terrorist attacks in Syria and other countries. Our recommendations to carefully to verify the activities of all groups and organizations that are calling for international support and protection in order to make sure that they are not actually involved in crimes that need to be investigated and punished.
To be followed by the Regional Public Organization of Vatan. NGO sociologists, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Mr. Haydarov from Tajikistan. Terrorist and extremist organizations, of which some Tajikistanis are members, do not have the physical capacity to work against the state and the people on the territory of my country. However, online, on social media, they are continuing their unauthorized activities based on hate speech and dissemination of the ideas of terrorism, the ideology of violent extremism, and religious radicalism. They're exploiting the fact that they have been granted asylum in European countries so as to sow social and political discord and religious hatred in the Tajikistani language online. These people stand convinced that just because they've been granted refugee status in Europe, they can act with impunity, spreading ideas about terrorism, information calling for terrorist acts to be committed, also justifying these acts online. Virulent rhetoric being spread by these people has resulted in the fact that they're now openly calling for an overthrow of the constitutional order in Tajikistan and the imposition of Sharia law. These destructive activities are, in our view, a flagrant and direct threat to the security of the people of Tajikistan. This is a cause of grave concern for the Tajikistani people. They are continuing their unlawful activities targeting Tajikistan while hiding in Europe. People are hiding from the hand of justice. They shouldn't be abusing their refugee status, nor should they be using taxpayer money to commit these acts. Representatives of these illegitimate groups who spoke here on behalf of Tajikistan don't actually live in the country, so they don't have any reliable information about the social and economic situation nor the political situation in Tajikistan. The information they've provided is most dubious. Distinguished participants, I believe that all will agree that the OSCE, as its name suggests, is first and foremost tasked with ensuring the security of all participating states. That's why OSCE participating states need to work hand in hand to ensure that we uphold security and combat terrorism, both bilaterally and multilaterally at the interregional level. Representatives of Tajikistani civil society believe that supporting Tajikistani's violation of human rights in Europe is itself a violation of international law. Thank you.
Speaker is the Regional Public Organization of Vatan, followed by the National Center of the Kyrgyz Republic for the Prevention of Torture. Regional Public Organization of Vatan, you have the floor.
Distinguished participants, dear colleagues, after the decomposition of the USSR, the world has been experiencing a deep moral crisis in the 90s because of democratization, privatization, and of Russian natural resources. Some 40 to 50 million people ended up dying early or not even being born. There was a sort of a genocide of the Russian peoples. And this was true of many other republics in the USSR. Look at Tajikistan. As a result of the civil war, according to certain data, some 150,000 people lost their lives and tens of billions of dollars worth of economic damage was done. And the political and economic sanctions against Russia after 2014 have not resulted in anything positive, but the situation of labor migrants, including Tajiks in Russia, has deteriorated, and Russia has had to adopt some strict laws in order to defend the labor market there. And the migrants, the labor migrants who support their families in Tajikistan were in fact earning half as much as previously. And this has resulted in an overall degradation of the socio-economic situation. Now, this Islamic Renaissance Party and others have been prohibited in Tajikistan, and this is resulting, in fact, of a moral degradation of some of the young people from Tajikistan who were elsewhere. They have ended up going to Syria to engage in terrorist activities or joining the Agida. the leaders of the Islamic Renaissance Party have been prohibited, and yet they have found support in countries of the European Union, and they're threatening Tajikistan from the outside. This results there should be sanctions against them, and they should be prevented from traveling to Western countries. And then Bin Laden's acts have been used as a pretext for certain actions by Western countries. And this can all result in Tajikistan being turned into a second Afghanistan. The horrors for the future can only be vaguely predicted. Thank you.
Inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants, I represent the National Center of the Kyrgyz Republic for the Prevention of Torture. We were set up in 2012. We were fully up and running in 2014 when we managed to hire all of the requisite staff. Since we started up our activities, we have visited over 5,000, on over 5,000 occasions. We visited places of detention. We met with thousands of detainees. And 55% of those visits were to the Ministry of Internal Affairs, correctional facilities in the Kyrgyz Republic. Starting in 2014 out to 2018, the number of requests we receive has increased by the year. But over the last year, looking at the statistics, what we can see is that there's been a drop in instances of torture, especially when it comes to torture such as suffocation using a plastic bags and beatings using a plastic bottle filled with water. The Public Prosecutor's Office has brought 30 criminal charges in 30 cases, thanks to our efforts. And some cases were brought specifically under the provisions for torture. Some of these cases are now before the courts and investigations are ongoing. Despite all of these efforts undertaken by both the government and civil society, the state and civil society, and they have been quite effective. Nonetheless, torture remains a problem in the Kyrgyz Republic. In 2012, a number of codes entered into force. These were the new versions of these codes, the Criminal Procedure Code and the Criminal Code. And thus, we filled the main gap when it comes to torture, as before we didn't have it enshrined in law, the status of someone who was supposedly invited for a so-called conversation. And now we filled that gap. So if someone is invited in for a conversation without their relatives being informed, without them being properly summoned, is not possible. If I may, 2 more minutes. The number of instances of these particularly perverted types of torture has been halved.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Centrum Polskie, to be followed by the NGO Sadokat. Centrum Polskie, you have the floor.
I welcome all participants. I represent the Polish Center. Ladies and gentlemen, today's subject is one of the most serious and topical problems that societies have to deal with. At the present time, hundreds of people have been victims of terrorism in various parts of the world. I would like to draw the attention of OSCE participating states to the situation of spreading terrorism in Nagorno-Karabakh, which is part of the Republic of Azerbaijan, but that has been occupied by armed forces of Armenia for 27 years now. On the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, in various ways.
Moderator, another point of order. These discussions are being politicized, which is beyond the content of discussions for this agenda, and I kindly ask you either to deny the representative that is speaking now the floor, or please tell them to speak and concentrate and focus to the content. I thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. The content of the interventions doesn't constitute one of the procedural issues on which point of orders are to be raised. That said, you will have the chance during the right of reply to respond to this. I would like now to give the floor back to the speaker, still with a call to remember about the topic of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you too. Доходы, получаемые от продаж.
Now, there is revenue from the sale of narcotics, illegal arms, that subsequently used by international terrorist organizations. Combating terrorism on the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh should be part and parcel of any anti-terrorist policy, but unfortunately, the world does not know what is happening in that area, which is under the control of the Armenian authorities, because there has never been permission given for international monitoring missions to go there. Now, on this occupied territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, 2 Azerbaijani citizens are located in prison, and they are subjected to severe torture by Armenian soldiers. And I would appeal to member states of the OSCE and to international organizations to pay very close attention to this deplorable situation. Thank you.
Followed by Penal Reform International Office in the Kyrgyz Republic. NGO Salokat, you have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Islamic Renaissance Party's membership has always used erroneous ideas which have sought to lead people astray. Francis Bacon believed that it is these erroneous ideas, erroneous thoughts can lead people astray. Francis Bacon believed that in order to do away with such ideas, we need to run experiments. If we look at the history of nations, of states, including our history, we can see that scientists, other public figures, fell victim to the erroneous ideas of certain individuals. And there are many people, such as Abolition and others. They all fell victim to such ideas. Lothar Duluev and many others, Muhammad Osmi amongst them, were terrorized by the founders of the Islamic Renaissance Party. Simply because they knew the history of the people, they could defend their national interests. I managed to speak to one of the members of the Islamic Renaissance Party, Mr. Desmat Rahim John, and he thought back to those years and told me that it is the members of the Islamic Renaissance Party who, funded by international investors, planned terrorist acts in Tajikistan. Iran and Afghanistan were amongst their backers. As this man told me, he himself unpacked crates full of guns coming from Iran. Members of this party want to establish an Islamic state in Tajikistan. However, as history has shown, they haven't managed to do that so far. They have used Islam as a fig leaf for their motives. They call themselves the Islamic Renaissance Party. Thus, they have managed to trick the people. They've also occupied various religious bodies. For instance, in some parts of the country, people are joining terrorist organizations like ISIS, Shabhat al-Nusra. Some have joined the Taliban, and now there's now a warrant out for them.
Penal Reform International Office in the Kyrgyz Republic, to be followed by the Office of the Ukrainian Parliament Commissioner for Human Rights. Penal Reform International Office in the Kyrgyz Republic, you have the floor.
Chairperson, distinguished delegates, Penal Reform International would like to draw attention to the application of life imprisonment as an issue that is increasing at such fast rate that the number of life sentence prisoners has doubled since 2000 year and now constitutes 500,000 people. In many cases, it is unnecessary punitive, especially when it's applied to non-violent crimes and does not satisfy the principle of proportionality. It's often restrict one of the purpose of imprisonment as such as set out in the United Nations Nelson Mandela rules. Life imprisonment without parole, in particular, raises issue of cruel, inhuman, and degrading punishment, and undermines the right to human dignity by taking away the prospect of rehabilitation. Monitoring bodies have found that life sentence prisoners are subject to unnecessary strict security measures and impoverished regimes. These measures are based on their sentence, not real risk, and can constitute ill treatment. To assist with a review of its application, please refer to the concrete recommendations we set out in our policy briefing on life imprisonment, available at penalreform.org in multiple languages. I would like to give floor to my colleague. Thank you.
Председатель, уважаемые делегаты, Международная территориальная реформа PRI хотела бы обратить ваше внимание на проблему пыток в Кыргызской республике.
Distinguished delegates, I'd like to draw your attention to some of the issues we've been facing. We received 238 complaints about torture. In fact, 123 of these complaints were about torture, and this was in the last year alone. Most of these came from Bishkek. 91% of these written complaints about torture and other inhuman, cruel, and degrading treatment or punishment. In fact, we received a wealth of these complaints, and this attests to the fact that we need to reform the system in the Kyrgyz Republic. For instance, when it comes to the questioning of witnesses and the accused, we want to introduce alternative measures, for instance, home arrest, alternatives to detention, and this will bring down the number of instances of torture in pretrial detention centers. We have many major problems, including when it comes to the conditions of detention, as many of the facilities were built during Soviet times. This will help. Some of these measures will help us to bring down prisoner numbers. There is no room for torture in our society.
Thank you. The next speaker is the Office of the Ukrainian Parliament Commissioner for Human Rights, to be followed by the NGO Homa. Office for the Ukrainian Parliament Commissioner, you have the floor.
Dear participants, Ukraine considers that torture and other forms of cruel punishment should be prohibited. We have a national preventive mechanism, and we monitor all places where people are deprived of their liberty, and if ever there are cruel treatment, we insist on that to be investigated. We also monitor the respect for the rights of our citizens who are in the temporarily occupied territories of Luhansk, Donbass, and Crimea, and Sevastopol. And we do receive information from human rights defenders, from victims and members of their families. Today, on the Crimean Peninsula, 113 Ukrainian citizens are being illegally held. Most of them are Crimean Tatars. And the local authority is continuing to hold our citizens without any basis, without any hope for a fair trial. The presumption of innocence is fully violated, ignored. There are cases of electric shocks, of beatings, of psychological pressure, lack of appropriately qualified medical care. And an analogous situation prevails in Donbass and Lugansk. And we hear from political prisoners and people who are in touch with them that they are used for hard labor, and citizens of Ukraine who have been forced to remain on the occupied territories are subject to torture. They don't have access to heat, to water, and to medical care. And with the return of 135 Ukrainian citizens to Ukraine, we have heard more information about cases of torture being applied to them in occupied Crimea and other parts of the Russian Federation. Now, we do hope that all of our citizens will be released on those territories and returned to their country, and we ask for the assistance of the international community to make sure that that will happen.
Yohoma, you have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, terrorism is a threat of global proportions. It matters to all of us. Terrorist acts, of course, lead to suffering. First and foremost, the suffering of women and children, especially those whose husbands and fathers are members of terrorist organizations. They've been forced to migrate. They've been held hostage. All sorts of untold suffering is being deposited upon them. In fact, some of these women are involved in terrorist zones. Tajikistan has brought many young people and women home. Unfortunately, these young people were enlisted into the ranks of terrorist organizations on the pretext that they were going to work. Very often, Islamic teachings are used to lure them in. Also, justice is used as an argument. We must combat Islamic fanaticism as it leads to tragedies. We've learned the lessons of the past, and we won't let past mistakes be repeated. Extremist and terrorist groups operating outside the country, continuing to supposedly promote democracy, to promote their ideas, they're wrong. The women of Tajikistan stand in solidarity with all women throughout the world fighting against terrorism. We support peace. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is the Russian Federal Bar Association, to be followed by the Russian LGBT network. Russian Federal Bar Association, you have the floor. Is there a representative of the Russian Federal Bar Association in the room? No. In that case, I am kindly asking the next speaker to take the floor, the Russian LGBT network. You have the floor, please, to be followed by the Paris Bar Association.
Mr. Moderator, ladies and gentlemen, in December of 2018, a report was disseminated. It was prepared within the framework of the Moscow mechanism of the OSCE. It focused on the intimidation and persecution, as well as arbitrary and unlawful detention and torture, enforced disappearances, and summary executions in the Chechen Republic of the Russian Federation. Specifically, the report talked about evidence of such events. None of the people responsible for these monstrous human rights violations have been held accountable. No investigation has taken place. The Russian Federation continues to deny that all of this took place, although it's been corroborated. Furthermore, people in the Chechen Republic are still being subjected to unlawful and arbitrary detention, torture, first and foremost because of their sexual orientation and gender identity. We recommend that the Russian Federation uphold its commitments to abolish torture and inhuman treatment, cooperate with international and organizations and NGOs. We call on the Russian Federation to exhibit goodwill and welcome an OSCE monitoring mission, which will help to take control of the situation on the territory of the Chechen Republic. The acting OSCE chairman should send a personal representative on a fact-finding mission to the Russian Federation to look into these violations and prepare the OSCE's response. We call on the Permanent Council to consider the human rights situation in the Russian Federation in light of the report prepared as part of the Moscow mechanism. We call on participating states to continue systematically monitoring and documenting human rights violations in the Chechen Republic and other regions of the Russian Federation. We call on participating states to cooperate with NGOs and to support them. We call on OSCE participating states to protect refugees from the Chechen Republic, especially LGBTI persons, taking into account their specific safety requirements, and we call on the OSCE participating states to tread very carefully when considering the extradition of all those from the Chechen Republic, considering that their life might be in danger in other parts of the Russian Federation.
The final speaker, before we move on to the right of reply part, is the Paris Bar Association. Paris Bar Association, you have the floor.
Thank you, moderator. I am the Vice President of the Paris Bar Association, and I'm speaking on behalf not only of the Paris Bar Association, but also of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, of which the Paris Bar Association is a founding member. I'd like to welcome the OSCE report entitled The Death Penalty in the OSCE Region, a background paper 2019. This document states, as the coalition often has, that detention conditions on death row often involve isolation and an absolute lack of medical care, and also a humiliation that really amounts to torture. I'd also like to refer to the situation of foreign combatants who have been sentenced to death in Iraq. This is also mentioned in the OSCE report. In fact, 11 French nationals were recently sentenced to death by the Iraqi authorities following expeditious proceedings and after, no doubt, having been victims of torture during their interrogations. The state of Iraq is one of the countries in the world that executes the greatest number of people, with more than 177 executions in the last 2 years. Iraqi law provides for the death penalty for anyone found guilty of just belonging to a terrorist organization, whether or not the accused has fought, and whether or not it's a man, a woman, or a child. We call on all member states to do their utmost to ensure that the death penalty is not carried out, to provide high-quality consular protection to all of their nationals who are detained abroad, whatever the crime they may have committed, and to consider the possibility, with due respect for the sovereignty of states, that their nationals who are implicated because of their membership of the Islamic State organization, that they be surrendered to their national courts for trial and, if necessary, to execute their sentence. Now, the Paris Bar and the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty call on all member states to support the World Day Against the Death Penalty, to join the call of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly's resolution regarding Belarus and the USA to establish a moratorium on all death sentences and executions with a view to abolishing the death penalty, call on the two countries where a moratorium is in place, namely Russia and Tajikistan, to become full abolitionists in law, and call on all participating states which are not party to the second optional protocol to the ICCPR and to the Protocol 6 and 13 of the European Convention on the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms to ratify those treaties and to provide information about the ratification process. Thank you for your attention.
We now proceed to the rights of reply part of this working session. We have a fair number of participating states who would like to exercise this right, so we are kindly asking you to limit your rights of reply intervention to 1 minute. The first I have on my list is Spain, to be followed by Belarus. Spain, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you, moderator. I'd like to refer to the statement made by Mr. Williams from Human Rights Without Frontiers. We listened very carefully to what he had to say, and I would like to take advantage of my right of reply by making just 2 points. First of all, the conditions of detention in Spain are very much in line with international standards and with commitments that have been taken on board by Spain in the field of human rights, which are fully respected. Second, I'd like to stress that there are appeal mechanisms in cases when there might be problems in order to make sure that people do, in fact, obtain legal protection.
Thank you. My delegation would like to exercise a right of reply. In fact, it was said that there's no transparency regarding the death penalty. Those who were sentenced to life in prison, well, their relatives are informed about that sentence. The death penalty is not enacted in public, although the relatives are, of course, informed. We want to underscore that the death penalty, capital punishment, is used in my country only in instances of serious crimes being committed, which often have an impact, a broad impact. We are engaging in open dialogue, and we will continue to engage in such dialogue with our foreign partners. Thank you.
The next speaker is France, to be followed by Tajikistan. France, you have the floor.
Thank you, moderator. I would like to exercise the right of reply of this delegation concerning what was said by Salut et Miséricorde. I haven't understood the link between the statement that was made and the theme of this session. The maximum period in which an abortion can be practiced is 12 weeks. 50,000 women die every year because of illegal abortion, and France is defending the right of every woman to control her own body. The right to abortion is part and parcel of that. Access to family planning, to sexual and reproductive health are absolutely essential to reduce maternal and infantile mortality. Those are priorities for France. We believe that every woman should be able to govern and control her own life in full safety and security. Thank you.
Tajikistan to be followed by Uzbekistan. Tajikistan, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Representatives of an extremist organization, the Islamic Renaissance Party, Group 24, and others stated that they are supposedly representatives of the political opposition in Tajikistan. Now let me draw your attention to the fact that these organizations have been recognized by the Supreme Court as terrorist and extremist organizations. They were in fact plotting a government overthrow, and 52 people died during that attempt. Someone said that apparently there's some kind of magazine where there's an interview given by someone from the delegation. No, we disavow such claims. We do not disseminate our viewpoints in any magazines. We just have the text which we've submitted to the Secretariat. That's it. Also, regarding Mr. Haitov's case, supposedly he's been systematically tortured. These are lies, blatant lies. Mr. Hait, perhaps you've met him. He's probably sick of lying. He must be sick of lying by now. So he probably said that's probably why he signed that statement saying that he's not been tortured. So the situation is under control. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Uzbekistan to be followed by Armenia. Uzbekistan, you have the floor.
Thank you, moderator. I'd like to take advantage of the right of reply in connection with statements made by representatives of civil society, and to state that in Uzbekistan there is full liability for the use of any testimony obtained by illegal means. And we have an article in the criminal code prohibiting torture in accordance with international standards. And in the years 2019-2021, we will be working on a new draft of the criminal code and the criminal procedure code. It is important, of course, that any testimony be obtained in a legal manner and that it be fully reliable to make sure that violence and torture are not carried out against individuals who are detained in prison institutions. We have several thousand video cameras that have been installed, many of them in isolation cells, but also in prison camps. And so individuals who are detained in accordance with recommendations of the UN, a national torture prevention mechanism has been put in place on a sort of an ombudsman plus basis.
You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to mention that there was a certain misconduct by Azeri pro-governmental organizations. I call upon the organizers of the team to assess this incident, particularly the demonstration of fake photos in order to prevent its repetition. These organizations are certainly a highlight of the HDUM, who promote political agenda of Azerbaijan by invoking conflict-related issues to cover up human rights violations, including torture in Azerbaijan. With regard to the case of Guliev and Taskerev that was raised here, I would like to emphasize that this criminal group committed a number of crimes of terroristic nature against citizens of Nagorno-Karabakh. The office of the ICRC in Stepanakert has regular access to them. During the trial, it was established that the criminal group was sent to Artsakh by Azerbaijan for espionage and subversive purposes. The president of Azerbaijan stated that these persons will receive the same support as Ramil Safarov, who asked an Armenian officer in his sleep. We understand that killing Armenians is not a crime, but a matter of glorification in Azerbaijan. But in the civilized world, including in Nagorno-Karabakh, killing is a crime. That's why they will continue to serve the justice. Now, I would like to refer to cases of torture implemented by Azerbaijan during the aggression of 2016 against Artsakh. During 22...
Sorry, please kindly conclude. Thank you.
Yes, I'm concluding. During 22 forensic examinations, it was found that 2 servicemen were beheaded after their murder. Another one was beheaded and his wrists were cut off when he was still alive. We call upon the OSCE to address these gross violations.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Lithuania, to be followed by Romania. Lithuania, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I would like to exercise my right of reply and provide some information in response to the statement made by the Russian Federation in relation to the ruling of the European Court for Human Rights regarding the case Abu Zabaidah versus Lithuania. I would like to ensure that the Republic of Lithuania fully assumes its duty to implement the court's judgment in this case. In April 2019, Lithuania submitted to the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe a detailed action plan concerning the implementation of this judgment, which was evaluated by the above-mentioned body, and the efforts of the government of Lithuania were acknowledged. We are planning to provide the updated information in respect of this judgment by the end of this year, as requested by the decision of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Romania, to be followed by the United States of America. Romania, you have the floor.
Thank you, Moderator. We wish to exercise our right to reply as regards the mention of the Al-Nashiri versus Romania case before the European Court of Human Rights during this session. We wish to firstly state that Romania remains firmly attached to the principle of respecting human rights and remains convinced that the capital punishment has to be universally abolished and that the prohibition of torture must not be limited or ignored under any circumstances, including the most difficult ones. As regards the particulars of the Al-Nashiri versus Romania case, it is to be mentioned that the case is currently in the execution phase, under the supervision of the Council of Europe Committee of Ministers, and Romania is fully committed to its execution. The Romanian authorities are also working in close interinstitutional cooperation in order to adequately respond to the conclusions of the Committee of Ministers adopted recently in this case and to identify the outstanding measures that need to be taken. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is the United States of America, to be followed by Canada. United States of America, you have the floor.
Thank you for letting us exercise our right of reply. With respect to the Russian assertion of sabotage, the United States is not subject to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights and is not a party to the proceedings mentioned. We cannot sabotage any inquiry and assume the states involved, trust the states involved, will comply with the court's orders. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Canada, to be followed by Kyrgyzstan. Canada, you have the floor.
Thank you, Moderator. In response to the concerns raised by the Russian Federation, I would like to state that Canada believes that the purpose of the correctional system is to contribute to the maintenance of a just, peaceful, and safe society by carrying out sentences imposed by courts for the safe and humane custody and supervision of offenders. The Correctional Service of Canada is committed to ensuring that everyone, staff, inmates, and visitors, is given equal protection, dignity, and treatment. The Correctional Service of Canada has developed mandatory diversity and cultural competency training for all staff. This training is designed to give staff the tools and information needed to actively support diversity and to respond in respectful, appropriate ways to ethno-cultural differences and needs. Canada has also developed gender, cultural, and trauma-informed correctional environments and interventions, services, and training opportunities designed specifically to consider an offender's social, economic, and cultural situation in society. The human rights of offenders in federal penitentiaries are monitored by the Correctional Investigator of Canada, a legislated and independent ombudsman. The offender grievances process allows offenders to raise concerns about conditions of confinement or events in the institution or the community if they believe their rights have been or are being violated. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Kyrgyzstan, followed by Azerbaijan. Kyrgyzstan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I wish to resort to the right to reply to intervention of 2 Kyrgyz NGOs. First is Kalim Shami, related to the evacuation of the Kyrgyz citizens from Syria. So I wish to stress that the Kyrgyz government is working on evacuation of our citizens who have been misled and found themselves imprisoned in the non-government controlled territories in Syria. Second of all, we closely work with the Kyrgyz NGOs and with the relatives of those, and hopefully in the nearest future we will bring them home safe and healthy. And My second reply is to the intervention by the Penal Reform International Office in Kyrgyzstan. Its representative has read out her statement so rapidly, so I wish to stress that she talks about 500,000 life imprisoned all around the world. And to specify the Kyrgyz statistics, I wish to tell you that we only have 344 life imprisoned persons in Kyrgyzstan, and the government is continuing the process of humanizing the criminal code. The second issue is torture. Torture is prohibited by the Kyrgyz constitution. Presently, the government of Kyrgyzstan, in cooperation with the Office of the Ombudsman and the National Center for Torture Prevention, have concluded the memorandum according to which they carry out arbitrary checks of places of detentions in order to monitor the situation of the
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you. And the next speaker and final one on our right of reply list is Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. In fact, by trying to turn to some other issues by the Armenian delegation, the delegation is trying to cover up the fact of occupation of Azerbaijani lands and coming to torture during the aggressive act of Armenia in April 2016. Many Azerbaijani soldiers were subject to post-mortal torture, such as ears of some were cut or eyes were out. And when it comes to Dilgam and Shahbaz, their aim was just to visit the graves of their parents, and which was located in Nagorno-Karabakh region, which lays within the international recognized borders of Azerbaijan. And Dilgam and Shahbaz were captured and beaten, tortured by Armenian armed forces and kept under inhuman conditions. And the question is not what Dilgam and Shahbaz were doing in Nagorno-Karabakh, but the question is what Armenian armed forces are doing on the Azerbaijani territories. And in fact, the truth is that the Armenian armed forces occupied Nagorno-Karabakh and 7 surrounding regions, which is 20% of Azerbaijani territories. And Azerbaijan still remains committed to solving the conflict peacefully within the recognized international borders of the country of Azerbaijan. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you very much. We have come to the conclusion of the right of reply part of this session, and as we have still a couple of minutes left before 6, I would like to give the floor back to our introducer for her final reflections.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very quick, and I will abuse my role of introducer to immediately announce that because I'm going to speak in less than 1 minute about torture, which featured greatly in this rich 3-hour discussion, there's a side event starting in 15 minutes on which I'll be a panel exactly about torture. So please do come if you want to hear some practical solutions on how we can help civil society aid and support states in combating torture. As I said, I note with consternation that a large part of the discussion was devoted to torture. In particular, I noted how human rights defenders and lawyers are increasingly and regularly subjected to torture themselves, either via attacks online or physical attacks or psychological attacks. And I want to repeat that these are the people that should not be targeted if they are indeed abiding with the law, that we should all see them as our aides and our supporters. I would like, in the same breath, to commend the civil society organizations who in this forum and beyond continue to work on rehabilitation of torture practices and work with torture survivors, including and increasingly in a good way, but also sadly working with lawyers who don't have sufficient experience in dealing with torture or the trauma that results from working consistently on trauma. The last thing I'd like to say is that I did hear, sadly, what I had brought up in my comments, that the principle of non-discrimination when using counterterrorism measures is not being sufficiently respected, and I would advise states to be very careful not to single out disproportionately ethnic or religious groups in their fight against terrorism. Thank you.
Thank you, and we have indeed now come to the end of this working session. So I would like, first of all, to thank once again our introducer for her interesting intervention at the beginning, for her final thoughts now. I would like to thank all of you, all the participants, for your interventions and your statements and your participation in this working session. I would like to thank all my colleagues at my sides, behind me, who have been helping very much in moderating this session. I would like to thank the interpreters for facilitating communication among us during the working session. Finally, I would like to draw your attention to side events that are taking place after this session, and one of which is organized in cooperation with ODIHR on effective multilateralism in the fight against torture. That is in meeting room 2, and we will be presenting a series of recommendations made by participants at a recent conference on multilateralism in the fight against torture. With this, I conclude this working session, and I thank you all again.
Do we have side event organizers in this room?